The letter hit the dirt at Eliza Marlowe's feet like it had been thrown, not handed. Harlan Voss didn't even look at her when he did it, just flicked his wrist, the way you'd toss scraps to a dog, then turned back to the men gathered around him on the steps of the land office. "Read it or don't," he said, loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Makes no difference to me what a washerwoman thinks." Someone laughed, then someone else. By the time Eliza bent down to pick up the envelope, the whole crowd was watching not with sympathy, but with the dull satisfaction of people who enjoy seeing the world stay exactly as it is. She didn't open it there. She tucked it under her arm and walked away with her chin level and her jaw tight, and she told herself she would not cry on that street, not where they could see her. She didn't know yet that the letter would change everything, that the man who'd thrown it would come to regret it in ways she couldn't have imagined standing there in the dust. But that moment, that small, ugly public moment, was where the real story of Red Hollow began. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who thought they already knew your worth, stay with me. This one's for you. And before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and follow this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Girl Nobody Saw. The town of Red Hollow had a way of sorting people without ever holding a vote on it. There were the Voss men, the Dalloway family, the Hendersons, with their 3,000 acres out past the creek, and then there was everyone else. The shopkeepers who owed them credit, the ranch hands who needed their work, the women who cooked, cleaned, mended, and disappeared into the background of every photograph taken in that valley. Eliza Marlowe had belonged to the background for so long, she sometimes forgot she was standing in it. She was 29 years old that summer, and she had lived in Red Hollow her entire life. Her father had been a farmhand before his back gave out. Her mother had taken in sewing until her eyes went bad. They had nothing to leave her when they passed, except a small two-room house at the edge of town that flooded every April, and a reputation for being decent, quiet people who knew their place. Eliza knew her place. She'd had it explained to her enough times. She worked at the dry goods store 6 days a week, keeping the ledgers and ordering stock, and doing the quiet, necessary work that kept the whole operation running, while old Clement Pryor sat in the back and told customers he'd built everything himself. She was paid enough to eat and keep the house, not enough to save, not enough to matter, in the way the town measured mattering. What she had instead of money was a notebook. It was a plain thing brown cover, water-stained at the corner from the flood 2 years back. She'd been keeping it since she was 17, filling it with observations, calculations, ideas. She'd read every farming almanac that came through the store, every land survey document she could get her hands on, every pamphlet about cattle grazing and soil rotation and water management that the ranchers ordered and then left sitting on the counter without opening. While they talked over her head about what wouldn't work, she quietly made notes about what might. Nobody asked to see the notebook. Nobody knew it existed. That was fine. She hadn't written it for anyone else. The morning the letter arrived, Harlan Voss threw it at her feet, had started like any other. She'd woken before the sun, got the fire going, eaten a heel of bread with some salt pork left from the night before. She'd walked the 12 minutes to the store, unlocked the back door, and started on the week's inventory before Clement arrived, smelling like whiskey and good humor. The letter had come with the Morning Post, addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. She'd put it in her apron pocket to read later, because there was work to do first. She hadn't expected Harlan Voss to be at the land office when she passed by on her lunch break. But there he was. Harlan Voss was 45, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome and had since hardened into something more like a warning. He owned the second largest ranch in the valley. He had 3 lawyers on retainer, 2 county commissioners in his pocket, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He also, Eliza knew, had been trying for 2 years to acquire the small parcel of land that bordered his eastern fence line. The parcel that, as it happened, had been her father's. The parcel she had inherited quietly and had so far declined to sell. She hadn't thought he'd noticed, Miss Marlowe. He'd said it like it was a joke, stepping down from the land office stairs to intercept her on the boardwalk. "I was just talking about you." She'd stopped. She should have kept walking. Mr. Voss. You get a letter recently? From a surveying office up in Harwick? She'd felt the weight of it in her apron pocket before she even reached for it. I haven't read my mail yet. Well, he'd plucked it from her hand before she could stop him, quick and easy, the way he did everything, torn it open, glanced at it, and then dropped it at her feet. Go ahead. Read it. The men behind him had watched with that particular stillness of people waiting to see something they've already decided will be funny. She'd picked it up. She'd read it standing there on the street with Harlan Voss blocking her path, and she'd understood, with the sick drop of her stomach, exactly what it meant. The survey was wrong, or rather it had been altered. The boundary line of her father's parcel had been redrawn in the official county record, shifting it 200 feet east, which meant that by the county's current documentation, a significant portion of what her family had owned for 30 years now technically belonged to Harlan Voss. Surveyors make errors, Voss said pleasantly. It happens. Counties already accepted the corrected filing. That's not a correction, Eliza said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how. That's a theft. He smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. That's a funny word from a woman who can't afford a lawyer. He turned back toward his men. Send me an offer, if you want to sell the rest of it, before I have to take that too. Though I can't imagine why I'd pay much. He walked away. Crowds dispersed. Eliza stood on the street with the letter in her hand and the laughter still settling around her like dust after a cart passes. She walked back to the store. She finished the afternoon's work. She locked up at 6, walked home, sat down at her kitchen table, and spread the letter flat and read it 3 more times. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and started writing. She had not allowed herself to fall apart. She'd learned young that falling apart was a luxury. Grief could wait. Anger could wait. What couldn't wait was figuring out what to do. Problem, as she mapped it, was layered. The county had already accepted the altered survey. Challenging it would require a lawyer, which required a money she didn't have. Harlan Voss knew this. He had engineered the whole situation around this exact fact that the truth didn't matter if you couldn't afford to prove it. She wrote down every detail she could remember about her father's original land documentation. The deed recorded in 1861. The fence posts her father had set himself and described in letters she still had, stored in a tin box under her bed. The neighbor who'd witnessed the original boundary survey, old Pete Dunmore, who was still alive out on his property if his daughter's reports were accurate. She wrote until midnight. Then she blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and thought about Wyatt Calder. She didn't know why he kept coming into her mind. She'd only spoken to him twice in her life, brief, practical exchanges at the store. He'd been away for 3 years, working some cattle operation up north, and had only recently come back to Red Hollow to deal with his family's failing ranch. She knew him by reputation more than anything. Hard worker, fair man, known for not tolerating dishonesty in his dealings. His father had built the Calders spread from nothing, and Wyatt had spent the years since his father's death trying to hold it together against the kind of slow financial bleeding that had ruined half the valley's smaller operations. What she knew about Wyatt Calder specifically was that he had turned down Harlan Voss's offer to buy the Calder Ranch last spring, twice, which meant he was either principled or stubborn, and either way, Harlan Voss already considered him an obstacle. She wasn't sure why that felt important. She filed it away and slept. The next morning, 2 things happened. First, Clement Pryor called her into the back of the store and told her, with genuine discomfort in his voice, that he'd have to let her go at the end of the month. Business was slow, he said. He needed to cut somewhere. He didn't quite meet her eyes, and she understood with the clarity of someone who has spent years reading people who think they're unreadable that Harlan Voss had paid him a visit. She thanked Clement for the notice and went back to the front counter and finished restocking the flour without saying another word about it. Second, Wyatt Calder came into the store. He was taller than she remembered, lean in the way of men who work hard and don't eat enough, with dust on his jacket and a cut above his left eyebrow that was maybe 2 days old and hadn't been properly cleaned. He moved like someone carrying a weight he'd gotten used to, which was different from someone who'd set the weight down. He needed fencing supplies. She helped him find what he needed, quoted him the price, wrote it in the ledger. He paid cash, which meant he was being careful. He was almost to the door when he stopped. "You're Eliza Marlowe," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Your father was Thomas Marlowe. He had the parcel on the east side of the valley near the drainage creek. She watched him. He did. Wyatt turned around fully and looked at her the way people rarely bothered to look at her, like he was actually trying to understand what he was seeing. I heard what Voss did with the survey. Word travels fast. Voss made sure of it. There was something flat in his voice when he said the man's name. He wanted people to know. She set down the ledger. What people? People like me. He shifted the fencing wire in his grip. People who are next on his list and might be thinking about whether to fight or sell. He paused. He figured watching him bury a woman over a land dispute would help them decide. The honesty of it caught her off guard. She'd been expecting sympathy, maybe, or the careful distance of someone who didn't want to get involved. Not this, did it? She asked. Help you decide? He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, not pity, not quite. More like recognition. I haven't decided anything yet, he said. But I've been thinking about my drainage problem on the south pasture. And I've heard you know a fair amount about land and water management for someone who works in a dry goods store. She blinked. Who told you that? Pete Dunmore's daughter. She said her father used to say Thomas Marlowe's girl understood more about land than most men he'd met, and Thomas Marlowe had learned it from her. Eliza felt something shift in her chest. She hadn't expected Pete Dunmore's daughter to know her name, let alone say it in that context. I have ideas, she said carefully. Whether they're good ones is a different question. I'd like to hear them, Wyatt said. If you're willing. She studied him for a moment, the same way she'd been studying people her whole life, from the background of rooms, reading the small signals, the way someone held themselves, the gap between what they said and what they meant. Wyatt Calder didn't look like a man trying to use her. He looked like a man who was running out of options and had the rare self-awareness to know it. Come back Thursday, she said. I'll bring my notebook. He nodded once, the way men in this valley nodded when they meant something short, no performance in it. He turned back toward the door. Mr. Calder. He stopped. She said it before she could think too carefully about whether she should. Your drainage problem on the south pasture. It's not actually a drainage problem. It's a compaction problem. The soil's too dense for the water to move. If you break it up along the western edge before the rains come, you'll retain about twice what you're losing now. He stood still for a second. Then he turned around again, and this time there was something different in his face, something that hadn't been there before. How do you know that? He asked. I walked that pasture once, years ago, before your father fenced it different. The ground has a particular sound when it's compacted wrong. She paused. I know that sounds strange. It doesn't, he said, and he sounded like he meant it. He left. She watched the door swing shut behind him and stood in the quiet of the store, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the specific feeling of being seen, not pitied, not dismissed, not used but actually seen, the way her father used to see her when she was a girl running her hands through soil and telling him things about it that surprised him. It was a small feeling. She didn't trust it yet, but she didn't throw it away either. She spent 3 days preparing for Thursday. She pulled every note she'd ever made about the Calder land, not because she'd been thinking about it specifically, but because she thought about all the land in the valley, the way some people memorize weather or faces. She'd cataloged the Calder spread in her notebook 2 years ago when she'd had reason to walk its boundary while arguing with a county assessor about her own parcel. She'd noted the soil variations, the way the creek ran in dry months versus wet, the east-facing slope that caught morning frost longer than the western pasture. She didn't sleep well those 3 days. She was also quietly looking for work, going door to door among the smaller businesses in town, asking with the careful neutrality of someone who doesn't want to show desperation. She got 2 offers. One was from a laundry service that would pay her half what she'd made at the store. One was from a woman named Ada Greer who ran the boarding house and needed someone for afternoons. She took both because she needed both, and she told herself it was temporary. She didn't fully believe that yet. Thursday came. Wyatt Calder arrived at the store 10 minutes before it opened and waited outside without complaining about the wait, which told her something about him. She let him in and they sat at the back counter with her notebook between them and talked for 3 hours. And since somewhere in the middle of the second hour, she forgot to be careful. She said things she'd only ever said to herself. about irrigation channels and soil pH, and the way the valley's water table had shifted since the Dalloway operation had rerouted the northern creek. She talked about her father's land and what it had been before everything. She talked about the economics of small ranching operations, the narrow margins, the ways the big operators squeezed them, the specific vulnerabilities that Harlan Voss had been exploiting systematically for 15 years. Wyatt listened. He asked questions that weren't dumb questions. He pushed back on two of her ideas in ways that made her refine them, which she appreciated more than she expected to. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to offer you a position," he said. She looked up. "I know it's not a normal arrangement," he said before she could respond. "And I know you'd be walking into a situation that's already in trouble. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He looked directly at her. "But I've talked to 3 ranch managers this month, and not one of them said anything as useful as what you've told me in the last 2 hours. Mr. Calder Wyatt, I don't have formal credentials. I'm a woman with a notebook and opinions." "I know what you are," he said, and the directness of it stopped her. "I'm asking whether you want to use it." The room was quiet. Outside, she could hear the first sounds of the town, waking up horses, someone calling out, a door banging shut down the street. The same sound she'd listened to her whole life from the margin of things. She thought about the altered survey, about Clement Pryor's guilty sideways glance, about Harlan Voss throwing a letter at her feet and laughing. She thought about the notebook under her arm, full of ideas she had never once been invited to use. "What are you offering?" she asked. He named a wage that was better than she'd expected. Not generous, the ranch was struggling, and she could see in his numbers that he knew it but honest. He offered her a room on the property, which she wasn't sure she'd take. He offered her a stake in whatever recovery the ranch managed, which surprised her enough that she made him repeat it. "Why?" she said. He thought about it. "Because if you do what I think you can do, you'll have earned it. And because I've spent 3 years watching men get paid well for doing mediocre work, and I'm done with that approach." It was not a romantic answer. It was a practical one. That was exactly why she believed it. "I'll need Fridays to handle my own legal situation," she said. "Done. And I'm going to need access to every financial record, every deed, every water agreement the ranch has made in the last 10 years. Something moved in his expression, surprise maybe, or something close to relief, like he'd been expecting a smaller ask. "Done," he said again. She looked at him across the counter, this man with the cut above his eyebrow and the dust on his jacket and the specific kind of tiredness that comes from fighting too long for something you refuse to give up. "All right," she said. She closed the notebook. She started on a Monday. The Calder Ranch sat 11 miles southwest of town, at the end of a road that turned to mud in spring and to bone-white dust in August. Eliza arrived at 6 in the morning with a canvas bag holding 2 changes of clothes, her father's tin box, and the notebook. She had walked the last 4 miles because the man who'd offered her a ride had turned around at the fork and said he'd forgotten an errand, which they both knew was a lie. Wyatt met her at the gate. He looked like he hadn't slept. "You walked. Part of it. You should have said. I'd have come for you." "I didn't want to start by asking for something," Eliza said. He absorbed that. "That's going to be a problem eventually." "Probably." He took her bag before she could argue about it and walked her up the rise toward the main house, and that was when she got her first honest look at what she'd agreed to. Calder spread had been beautiful once. She could see the bones of it, the long, low barn with its good stone foundation, the corrals laid out sensibly, the house with its wide porch built by a man who intended to sit on it in his old age. But the barn's east side had lost half its siding and been patched with mismatched board. 2 of the corral rails were down. The pump house had a tarp over the roof. There were 4 horses in a pasture that had been built to hold 30. "You said it was in trouble," Eliza said. "It is." "You didn't say how much." Wyatt kept walking. "I figured you'd see it soon enough. I'd have preferred to see it before I said yes." He stopped then and turned around, and there was something honest and a little raw in his face. "Would you have said no?" She thought about it. "No," she admitted. "But I'd known what I was walking into. And that's a different thing than being managed." "Fair," he said. And then after a moment, "I'm not used to this." "Used to what?" "Somebody asking me straight questions." He started walking again. "Everybody around here either wants something from me or feels sorry for me. You do neither, and I don't have a script for it." The crew was waiting by the barn. 4 men. Eliza had expected more and had already, in the walk up from the gate, revised her financial projections down by a third. The oldest of them stepped forward. He was maybe 60, gray through the beard, built like something that had been left out in the weather for a long time and hadn't rotted yet. Cal Renner, Wyatt said. My foreman. He worked for my father 22 years. Cal did not offer his hand. He looked at Eliza the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he didn't order. Ma'am, Mr. Renner, Wyatt tells me you're going to be handling the books, among other things. What other things? Operations, Wyatt said. Cal's jaw moved. Operations. That's right. With respect, Cal said, in the tone men use when they mean the exact opposite. We've got 150 head to move before the water dries in the North Draw. We've got a fence line down along Voss's property that I've mended 3 times this month, and we've got a payment due at the bank in 11 weeks that we are not going to make. What part of that is she going to help with? All of it, Wyatt said. The silence that followed had a shape to it. Eliza had spent her whole life in rooms where men decided things around her. She knew how this went. She could stay quiet and let Wyatt fight it for her, and she'd be his project for as long as she stayed, protected and resented in equal measure. Or she could open her mouth and probably make it worse. She opened her mouth. You mended the fence 3 times this month, she said to Cal. Same section? He looked at her, surprised into answering. Roughly. How far from the creek crossing? 1/4 mile north. That's not weather, Eliza said. That's a section where the ground slopes toward Voss's side, which means when you mend it, his cattle push against it downhill. It'll keep going. You need to move the line 8 feet west onto the flat, or brace it with an angle post every 12 feet instead of every 20. Cal Renner said nothing for a moment. That's the county line, he said finally. Can't move a fence off the county line. You can if the fence isn't the boundary. Is it? It's been the boundary for 30 years. That's not what I asked. He stared at her. Behind him, one of the younger men, a lanky kid of maybe 19 with a bad sunburn across his nose, was watching this exchange with open fascination. No, Cal said at last, grudgingly. The deed line runs down the creek. The fence just got built where it got built. Then you can move it 8 feet and stop wasting a day a week. Cal Renner looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. We'll try it, Cal said, and walked off toward the horses without another word. Kid with the sunburn hung back. Tobe Whitfield, ma'am, he said. That was something. It was a fence. Yes, ma'am. But it was something. He grinned and went after Cal. Wyatt exhaled slowly through his nose. That went about how I expected, he said. He's going to hate me. Cal doesn't hate anybody. He just doesn't change his mind unless the evidence beats us out of him. He paused, which, to be fair, is the same thing from the outside. She asked for the records that night, and Wyatt gave them to her, and by 2 in the morning, she understood that he had not been entirely honest with her. She found him on the porch at 2:30. He was sitting on the steps with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, doing nothing in particular, which she would come to learn was what he did instead of sleeping. She sat down 2 feet away and set the ledger on her knees. You said 11 weeks to the bank payment, she said. That's right. You didn't say there were 2 payments. He didn't answer. There's a note for $4,000 at Red Hollow Savings, which is the one Cal knows about. And there's a private note for $2,800 to an individual lender dated March of last year, unsecured at 14%. She kept her voice level. 14%, Wyatt. I know what it is. Who's the lender? The name's abbreviated. MS. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Merritt Shaw, he said, the banker. Personally. Not through the bank. Eliza set the ledger down very carefully, because her hands had gone tight on it. The man who holds your first note also holds a private note against you at 14%. Yes. Why would you do that? Because in March of last year, I had 200 head that had to be fed through a bad winter, and no money to feed them. And if I lost them, I lost everything. And Merritt Shaw was the only man in this valley who'd hand me cash without making me sign the whole place over. He said it flatly. He wasn't defending it. It was a bad deal. I took it. I'd take it again. Because the other option was watching the herd starve, and then getting the same result 12 months earlier. She sat with that. You should have told me, she said. I know. No, listen to me. You should have told me, because I spent 4 hours tonight building a plan around a number that was wrong. Everything I mapped out is garbage now. That's 4 hours I don't have. Her voice had climbed. She pulled it back down. If you hide things from me, I'm useless to you. I'm not going to be useful and blind at the same time. Pick one. Wyatt looked out at the dark. Nobody else knows about the Shaw note. Not Cal, not anybody. Why? Because the day it gets out that I'm borrowing at 14%, every man who works for me starts looking for another job, and every man who sells to me wants cash up front, and it's over. It's over in about 6 weeks, and you thought I'd talk. I thought he stopped. Started again. I didn't think you'd talk. I thought if I said the whole number out loud in that store on Thursday, you'd have done the arithmetic and walked out. And I needed you to say yes. It was, she thought, the first genuinely selfish thing he'd said to her, and she found she respected him more for admitting it than she would have for a better answer. All right, she said. That's it? All right. You lied to get me here. It worked. Now I'm here, and I'd rather spend my time on the problem than on being angry about it. She picked the ledger back up. But if you do it again, I'll go, and I won't argue with you about it first. I'll just be gone in the morning. Understood. Say it back to me. He turned and looked at her. You'll be gone in the morning. Good. She opened the ledger. Now come here and explain to me what the $800 in October went to, because the entry just says settlement, and I don't like the way that word looks. He came. The thing about the Calder Ranch Eliza discovered over the following weeks was that almost nothing about it was broken in an interesting way. It was broken in 100 small, boring ways that had been stacking up for 6 years while a good man ran himself into the ground trying to fix the biggest one. She started with the water. The Calder land held rights to a creek that ran down from the northern ridge and had held them since Wyatt's father filed on them in 1858. But the flow had been dropping for 4 years, and everyone, including Wyatt, had assumed it was drought. Eliza walked the creek, all of it 9 miles, over 4 days, in boots that were wrong for it, coming back each evening with her feet blistered and her notebook full. On the 4th evening, she came into the kitchen, where Wyatt and Cal were arguing about hay prices, dropped the notebook on the table, and said, "It's not drought." Cal stopped mid-sentence. 2 miles above your northern boundary, there's a diversion channel, Eliza said. Hand dug. Maybe 3 years old, maybe 4. It's cut so it only takes water above a certain flow level, which means in a dry year you barely notice, and in a wet year it takes almost half. That's Dalloway land up there, Cal said. It's Dalloway land on the map. There's a Voss brand on the stock watering out of that channel. Cal sat back slowly. You're saying Voss dug a channel on Dalloway ground, Wyatt said. I'm saying somebody did, and Voss cattle are drinking from it. And if I had to guess, I'd say the Dalloways either don't know or were paid not to. She sat down across from them. I also went up on the ridge and looked at the whole watershed from above. Your creek isn't the only one that's dropped. The Hendersons lost their eastern spring 2 years back. The Ochoa place gave up and sold in, when was it? 81, Cal said quietly. 81. And Pete Dunmore's daughter told me her father's well started coming up brackish, the same year he refused an offer from Voss. The kitchen was very quiet. That's a hell of an accusation, Cal said. It's not an accusation. It's a pattern. Eliza opened the notebook and turned it around so they could both see the map she'd drawn the valley, the water, the properties, small marks beside 4 of them. An accusation would require evidence. What I have is a shape. But I've learned that when you find a shape like this, there's usually paper somewhere that explains it, because men like Harlan Voss don't do things illegally when they can find a way to do them legally and have it hold up. Cal Renner stared at the map for a long moment. Then he said, to Wyatt, and not to her, where'd you find her? Dry goods store, Wyatt said. Huh, said Cal. It wasn't an apology. But he pulled his chair closer to the table, and he stayed for the next 2 hours while she walked them through it. And he asked 5 questions, and every one of them was a good question. The compaction work on the south pasture was where it nearly went wrong. She'd proposed it in the 2nd week, break up the hard pan along the western edge before the rains, and the pasture would hold twice the water it had been holding. Cal had said it was a waste of 8 man-days they didn't have. Wyatt had said do it anyway. Cal had done it because Cal did what he was told even when he thought it was stupid, and that was both his best and worst quality. 2 days into the work, one of the horses went down in a soft spot. They'd opened up and came up lame. Eliza heard about it from Tobe, who came running up to the house looking green. Which horse? The bay, Cal's. She got there in 11 minutes. The horse was standing wrong on its off foreleg, and Cal Renner was crouched beside it with his hat off, and when he looked up at her, his face was the face of a man deciding something. You want to tell me how you didn't know the ground was soft there? He said. I didn't know. You walked this pasture. You told Wyatt you knew what was under it. I told him it was compacted. It is compacted. There's a seam of soft fill running under the western third that I did not know about and could not have known about without digging. She kept her voice steady because she could hear how much she wanted to defend herself, and she knew that would make it worse. I was wrong about the ground. I wasn't wrong about the compaction. Both of those are true. That's a fine distinction to a horse. It is. She looked at the bay. Is he going to be all right? Cal ran his hand down the leg. Strain, not a break. 6 weeks. Maybe 8. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't. He stopped himself. Put his hat back on. Stood up. You know what the difference is between you and every other person who's come here with a big idea in the last 6 years? No. They'd have told me the horse stepped wrong. He took the lead rope. You told me you were wrong about the ground. He led the bay away. Tobe, standing off to the side, said in a low voice, I think that's the nicest thing I ever heard him say to anybody. That was nice, ma'am. He once told his own brother to go drown in the creek. The rains came 4 weeks later. The south pasture held. It held so well that Cal walked the whole western edge twice with his hands in his pockets, and then came up to the house and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, without preamble, how much of the north section could we do? All of it, Eliza said. If we had the labor, we don't. No, how much labor? 6 men, 3 weeks. Cal chewed on that. What if it was 4 men in 6 weeks? Then it wouldn't be done before the fall grass, and the whole point is to have it in before the fall grass. Huh, said Cal, and went away, and the next morning she came out to find him hitching a team with 2 men she had never seen before. Who are they? Ochoa boys, Cal said. Their father sold out in 81. They're doing day work at the Henderson place for near nothing. He didn't look at her. I told them we'd pay them in beef and a share of the fall sale, since we don't have cash. They said yes before I finished the sentence. Cal, it was your arithmetic, he said. I just found the arms. Town found out in the way towns always found out. Eliza had kept the boarding house job for a month, riding in on Fridays for her legal errands and working Ada Greer's afternoons for the extra dollars. She gave it up in the 5th week because she couldn't spare the day. When she told Ada, the woman went quiet in a particular way. You're out there full-time now. I am. Living out there. I have a room in the old bunkhouse. Cal Renner's wife's sister stays in the main house as cook, so there's Eliza stopped, because she heard herself explaining, and she hated the sound of it. Yes, I'm living out there. Ada Greer was not an unkind woman. That was what made it worse. She reached across and put a hand on Eliza's wrist and said, in a voice full of real concern, honey, do you know what they're saying? I can guess. They're saying Wyatt Calder's ranch is failing, and he's gone soft in the head, and he took in a woman with no husband and no family to run his business, and there's only one reason a man does that. There's a second reason, Eliza said. She's good at it. That's not a reason people around here believe. I know. Then why? Because I'm 29 years old, and I have spent every one of those years being right about things in a room where nobody asked me, Eliza said. Her voice came out harder than she meant it to. And a man asked me. That's the whole story, Ada. That's all of it. And if the town would rather have the other version, because the other version is more entertaining, then the town can have it. Because I've got 150 head to move, and 11 weeks turned into 6. Ada looked at her for a long moment. You've changed, she said. No, said Eliza, I've just stopped whispering. Harlan Voss made his first direct move in the 7th week, and he did it the way he did everything publicly, cheerfully, and with paperwork. The Cattlemen's Association met the second Tuesday of every month in the back room of the Palace Hotel, which was neither a palace nor much of a hotel. Wyatt had gone to every meeting for 6 years and hated all of them. This time he brought Eliza. Cal had advised against it. You bring her in there, you're handing them the thing they want to talk about. They're already talking about it. Talking about it and having it stand in front of them are different animals. Then let them look at the animal, Wyatt said. They walked in at 7. There were maybe 30 men in the room. The conversation didn't stop it, did something worse, which was thin out and reorganize itself around them. Harlan Voss was at the front table with a glass of something amber and his hat on the chair beside him. He rose when he saw them, which was somehow more insulting than staying seated. Wyatt. Warm as a summer porch, and Miss Marlowe. This is a surprise. Harlan. I don't believe we've had a lady at one of these before. Voss looked around the room, inviting it. Have we, gentlemen? There's no rule against it, Wyatt said. No rule. Voss sat back down, just an oddity. Like a lot of things about your operation lately. Wyatt found 2 chairs. He set one for Eliza and then sat beside her. And the meeting started, and for 40 minutes it was ordinary grazing schedules. A dispute about a stray brand, the price of winter feed. Then Voss raised a hand. Before we close, I want to put something to the association. He leaned back. There's been talk about water in this valley. Talk about diversions. Accusations, even that somebody's been taking creek flow that isn't theirs. The room went still. Now, I don't know where that talk started. He turned his glass on the table, unhurried. But I'd like to remind everyone here that water rights in this county are a matter of public record. Anybody can look them up. And when a man or, I suppose, anybody starts walking other people's property lines with a notebook, making maps, asking questions of widows and old men, well, he smiled. That's not investigation. That's trespass. And it's slander. Nobody's been on your land, Wyatt said. That so? Voss's eyes moved to Eliza. Miss Marlowe. Have you been on my land? No, Eliza said. You've been up on the North Ridge. That's Dalloway land. And Mr. Dalloway's foreman gave me permission in writing. I have it in my bag if you'd like to see it. That landed. Voss's smile stayed, but something behind it recalculated. You keep permissions in writing, he said. I keep everything in writing. That's a very particular habit for a woman who used to keep a shop ledger. It's the same habit, Eliza said. It's just a bigger ledger. Somebody at the back of the room laughed a short, surprised bark, quickly swallowed. Voss's jaw tightened by maybe 1/16 of an inch. He turned to the room. I'll say this plain then. There's a lot of loose talk about my operation lately, and it's coming from one direction, and I'd like the association to consider whether a member who employs a woman with an open grievance against me a grievance about a boundary correction she's got no legal standing on ought to be trusted with the association's business. You want to put me out, Wyatt said. I want to protect this association from a man who's let his personal situation cloud his judgment. Wyatt stood up. Eliza, watching him, understood that she had never actually seen him angry before. It didn't look like she'd expected. He didn't raise his voice. He got very quiet and very still, and the room got quiet with him. 6 years ago, my father died, Wyatt said. In this room, 7 of you told me I'd lose the place inside 2 years. I've got the note from the bank to prove I haven't. In the last 6 years, I have not missed a single association assessment. I have not moved a single fence, and I have not taken 1 acre off a neighbor. I've had a bad run. Everybody in here has had a bad run except one man, and I'd invite you all to think about why that is. Nobody moved. As for Miss Marlowe, he didn't look at her. He looked at Voss. Since I hired her, our water losses are documented. Our south pasture is holding twice the moisture it held in the spring. Our fence line stopped failing, and I've got a plan on paper for the first time since my father was alive. Every one of you has come to me at some point in the last 3 years and told me I needed help. She's the help. If that offends anybody's sense of how things ought to look, you can vote me out and I'll go home. But I'd point out that I'll go home to a ranch that's in better shape than it was in March, and you'll go home to whatever Harlan tells you to. He sat down. The vote, when it came, went 18-11 in Wyatt's favor. It was not a victory. 11 men in that room had looked at him and decided he wasn't worth keeping, and he would remember every one of their faces. Outside in the dark by the horses, Eliza said, "That cost you." "Yes. Was it worth it?" Wyatt untied the reins. "Ask me in November." She found the surveyor's name on a Friday in the county recorder's office, in a stack of filings she'd asked for 4 times before the clerk finally stopped pretending not to hear her. Elias Pike, licensed surveyor, Harwick County. His signature was on the corrected boundary filing that had taken 200 feet off her father's land. It was also on the Eastern Spring reassessment that had cost the Hendersons their water in '82, and on the well line adjustment that had put Pete Dunmore's good well on the wrong side of a property line in 81, and on the original transfer paperwork when the Ochoa family sold. 4 filings, 4 properties, 1 name. Eliza sat in that cold little office with the 4 documents spread in front of her and felt her heartbeat somewhere up in her throat. She copied every word by hand. It took her 3 hours. Clerk offered, twice, to have copies made for a fee she couldn't afford, and both times she said no thank you and kept writing, because she'd learned that a receipt for a copy is a record that somebody made a copy. She got back to the ranch after dark. Wyatt was in the kitchen with the lamp low. Well, she put the pages on the table. He read them. She watched him read them. She saw the exact moment he understood the small backward tilt of his head, like a man who's been hit and hasn't decided yet whether to fall. 4, he said. That I've found. I'd guess there are more. I only looked at filings from 80 to 84, because that's all the clerk would pull for me. And Pike signed all of them. Pike signed all of them. Wyatt put the pages down. This isn't enough. No, a surveyor can work for a lot of people. Doesn't prove anything. No, it doesn't. What it proves is where to look. She sat down across from him. Here's what I want. I want to find Elias Pike. Not to threaten him, I want to find out what he's afraid of. Because a man who signs 4 fraudulent surveys is either being paid a great deal or being squeezed. And if he's being paid, we're finished. But if he's being squeezed, then he's ours, Wyatt said. Then he's his own, Eliza corrected. Which is more useful. Wyatt was quiet. Then, in a different voice, there's something I have to tell you. She waited. Before I went north, before my father died, he was looking at his hands. I worked a season for Harlan Voss. The kitchen clock ticked. I was 23, he said. My father and I had fallen out over something so stupid. I couldn't tell you what it was now. Voss offered me a job at twice what any outfit in the valley was paying, and I took it partly for the money and mostly to make my father angry. He rubbed his jaw. I rode for him for 8 months, and in the fall of that year he sent 4 of us out to the Reyes, place little 40-acre operation. Family had been there 20 years to move their cattle off a section they'd been grazing. He said it was his section. He had paper saying so. Was it his section? I didn't ask. Wyatt looked up at her. That's the part. I didn't ask. I moved a family's cattle off their own grass because a man with paper told me to, and I took my wages that Friday. And by spring the Reyes family was gone, and I never once thought about where they went. Eliza sat very still. So when I say Harlan Voss has been doing this for 15 years, Wyatt said, I'm not guessing. I know what he does. I know because I was one of the hands he used to do it. He pushed back from the table. You should have that before you decide how much of yourself to put into this. Because if we win, and this all comes out, my name's going to be in it somewhere. Not the worst name, but in it. Eliza thought about her father, who had been a good man and a limited one, and who had once told her that the only people worth trusting were the ones who'd tell you the bad thing before you found it. How long have you been carrying that, she asked. Since 1878. Does Cal know? Cal was the one who came and got me. Rode 2 days to Voss's line camp and stood there in front of the other hands and told me my father was sick and if I had any decency left I'd come home. A short breath that wasn't a laugh. So yes, Cal knows. Eliza looked at the 4 copied filings on the table. 4 families. One of them hers. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, she said. It isn't. I know. But I'll tell you this. There are 2 kinds of men who've done what you did. The kind who spend the rest of their lives explaining why it wasn't really their fault. She tapped the pages. And the kind who go looking for the surveyor. The sabotage started in the 9th week. First it was the fence again, but not the section that always failed. This one was cut clean, 4 strands, on the far side of the north draw, where nobody rode more than twice a week. 40 head of Calder cattle drifted 1.5 miles onto open range before Toby found them. Cal Renner walked the cut ends and came back with his mouth in a hard line. That's shears. Could be a break, Wyatt said. That's shears, Wyatt. Then the pump house. Someone pulled the leather off the pump seal in the night, a $2 part, 4 hours work to replace, and no water to the corrals for a day and a half in 90-degree heat. Then the hay. They'd bought 40 tons on credit against the fall sale and had it stacked and tarped south of the barn. And one morning in the 10th week, they found the tarp slit and 11 tons of it soaked through and already going to mold. Wyatt stood looking at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he walked into the barn, and Eliza heard something heavy hit a wall. She gave him 10 minutes. Then she went in. He was sitting on an overturned crate with his knuckles split and bleeding. That was stupid, she said. Yes, you need that hand. I know. He looked at the blood like it belonged to someone else. 11 tons. That's $300 I don't have and can't get. And it's not even the money, it's that I have to go tell Cal. And Cal's going to say we should have posted a night watch. And he's right. And I said no because I didn't want to pay 2 men to stand in a field. Eliza got the water and the clean cloth from the tack room shelf and came back and took his hand without asking permission, and he let her. Here's what I think, she said, working. I think he's not trying to ruin you. Not yet. Feels like he's trying. If he wanted to ruin you, he'd burn something. This is smaller than that. This is expensive and annoying and impossible to prove. She wrapped the cloth. He's trying to make you tired. He's done this before, Wyatt. He's got a method. He makes it cost more to fight than to sell, and then he shows up with a number and it feels like mercy. Wyatt watched her hands. How do you know that? Because that's what he did to my father, Eliza said. For 6 years, small things. A gate left open. A water share filed. Nothing you could take to the sheriff. And my father was a proud man and a tired man. And he died before he could decide which one he was. She tied the cloth off. And then Harlan Voss waited about 10 months and came for the land anyway. Wyatt flexed his hand. Then we post a watch. We post a watch, Eliza agreed. And we do something else. What? We stop acting like we're the only ones this is happening to. It took her 9 days to get 5 families in one room. The Hendersons came because they'd lost their spring and had never gotten a straight answer about it. Pete Dunmore's daughter Ruth came, pushing her father in a wheeled chair he hated, because the old man had insisted. 2 of the Ochoa brothers came from the day work they were doing at Calder. A widow named Josephine Pell came, whose husband had sold his section in '83 and drunk the proceeds and died, and who had opinions about all of it. They met in the Calder kitchen because there was nowhere in town that wouldn't have reported the gathering to Voss by supper time. It did not go well at first. You want us to what? Henderson said. He was a big, sour, careful man of 55 who had spent 3 years being polite to Harlan Voss at church socials. Sign a paper saying he stole from us? No, Eliza said. I want you to sign a statement of what happened to you. Not what you think Voss did. What happened. Dates, filings, what your land looked like before and after. That's the same thing dressed up. It isn't. And the difference is the entire case. She stood at the head of the table with her notebook open, and she made herself speak slowly. If you accuse Harlan Voss, it's your word against a rich man's, and you'll lose, and he'll sue you. If you state a fact in June of '82, my eastern spring was reassessed by surveyor Elias Pike and my water yield dropped by 60%. That's not an accusation. That's a fact. Nobody can sue you for it. When 5 separate families state 5 separate facts and the same name appears in all 5, a judge does the accusing for us. Silence. Ruth Dunmore said quietly. My father can't write anymore. He can talk. I'll write it and he'll make his mark, and you'll witness it, and it'll hold. Old Pete Dunmore lifted his head. His voice came out like a hinge. Thomas Marlowe's girl. Yes, sir. You still got that notebook? I've got a different one now. Same habit. The old man made a sound that might have been a laugh. Your daddy used to say you'd be trouble. He said it like a warning. He said it like a hope, Pete Dunmore said. Give me the pen. I'll make my mark. I'm 81 years old. And there's not one damn thing Harlan Voss can do to me anymore. Henderson still didn't sign. Not that night. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands and said, if this gets out and it doesn't work, I lose my line of credit at the bank, and I've got a boy in school in Harwick. I know, Eliza said. You don't. You've got nothing. That's why you can do this. It was the cruelest true thing anybody had said to her in months, and it landed exactly where it was aimed. That's right, she said. I've got nothing. Which means I'm the only one in this valley who can afford to be honest. And I'm telling you, it's a bad system when that's true. Henderson put his hat on and left. He came back 4 days later and signed. They got the cattle to market in the first week of October. 210 head, 40 more than Cal had thought possible. Moved on a schedule, Eliza had built around water availability rather than tradition, which meant they went 11 days earlier than any Calder herd had ever gone and hit the buyers before the Voss and Dalloway stock flooded the yards. They came in ahead of the market break by 6 days. The price held. Wyatt came back from Harwick with a bank draft and a face that didn't know what to do with itself. Cal Renner counted the number twice. That's the banknote, he said. That's the whole banknote and near 200 over. Yes. In one season, yes. Cal put the draft down on the kitchen table and stood there a moment. Then he turned to Eliza and did something she had not once seen him do in 5 months, which was take off his hat indoors. Ma'am, he said, I'd like to withdraw everything I said in June. You didn't say much in June. I said a considerable amount in June. You just weren't in the room for it. He put his hat back on. I'm saying it's withdrawn. Tobe Whitfield whooped. The Ochoa brothers were already talking about what a share of the sale meant to them. In Spanish, very fast, and one of them was doing arithmetic on his palm. Cal's wife's sister brought out a pie she'd been saving for something and cut it into far too many pieces. For about 4 hours, that kitchen was the happiest room in the valley. Eliza stepped out onto the porch near midnight because her chest was too full and she didn't entirely trust it. Wyatt came out a minute later with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without saying anything, and they stood there in the dark, listening to the noise inside. Say it, she said. Say what? Whatever you came out here to say. You've had the same face on for 2 hours. Wyatt let out a long breath. The Shaw note, he said, comes due in January. I know. We can't cover it. That's not it. He turned the cup in his hands. I saw Merritt Shaw in Harwick. He wasn't in Harwick for the bank. He was in Harwick with Harlan Voss's attorney. Eliza set her cup down on the porch rail very carefully. How sure are you? I watched them come out of the same building and shake hands on the street. She stood there, doing arithmetic she didn't want to do. He's going to sell the note, she said. That's what I think. He's going to sell the private note to Voss. And then Voss holds $2,800 of unsecured debt against this ranch at 14%, and he can call it whenever he likes. And when we can't pay it, he takes the place at a fraction of what it's worth. She heard her own voice go strange and thin. That's not a business move. That's a trap that's been open since March of last year. Yes, Shaw set you up. Maybe. Or maybe Shaw's just a coward with a bad loan who found a buyer. Wyatt's mouth twisted. The result's the same either way, and I've stopped caring about the difference. Harlan Voss rode out to the Calder ranch 9 days later. He came alone, at 2 in the afternoon, on a good horse, in a good coat, with a leather case under his arm. He tied up at the rail like a neighbor stopping by. Wyatt met him in the yard. Cal came out of the barn and stood 20 feet off, with a hand on a fence post. Tobe stopped what he was doing. The Ochoa brothers stopped. By the time Voss had his hat off, there were 7 people standing in that yard, and none of them were pretending to work. Eliza came out onto the porch. Wyatt Voss was smiling. Fine sale this year, I heard. The whole yard heard. What do you want, Harlan? I want to do you a courtesy. He opened the leather case and took out a folded document and held it up, unhurried, so everyone could see there was paper, and nobody could see what it said. As of Monday, I've acquired a promissory note against this property. $2,800, plus accrued interest. Signed by you March of last year. Nobody in that yard moved. Now the note is unsecured, Voss went on, which means technically I could demand it today. I'm not going to do that. I'm not an unreasonable man. He put the paper back in the case. You've got until the 15th of January, 90 days. Full amount in cash, and if I pay it, Wyatt said, then you pay it. And we shake hands, and that's the end of it. Voss put his hat back on. But Wyatt, you just spent your entire sale on the bank. Everybody in the yard at Harwick knows what you cleared and what you owed. There is no version of the next 90 days where you find $2,800. There's just the version where you spend 3 months killing yourself and hand it to me in January anyway, and the version where you sit down with me next week and I give you a fair price and you walk away with something in your pocket. He looked around the yard then, at Cal, at Tobe, at the Ochoa brothers. You boys ought to start asking around, he said, pleasantly. Come spring, this outfit's going to be under new management. And then he looked up at the porch. Miss Marlowe, he said, I'll say this to you plain, since you like things plain. You've had a good run. Better than I expected, I'll give you that honestly. And I don't give much honestly. But you've been playing a game where the rules are made out of paper, and you've never once stopped to ask, who's been writing the paper in this county for 15 years? He gathered his reins. It isn't you. Eliza came down 2 steps, Mr. Voss. He paused. You're right that I don't write the paper, she said. But somebody signs it. And I've got a list of what he's signed, and where, and when, and for how much. She let that sit exactly 1 second. Elias Pike is going to be a very interesting conversation. For the first time since she had known him, since the day he'd thrown a letter in the dirt at her feet on the main street of Red Hollow and taught the whole town to laugh at her Harlan Voss's face, did something he did not intend it to do. It was small. It was gone almost before it arrived. But everyone in that yard saw it. Harlan Voss rode out of the yard at a walk, which was worse than a gallop. A man who runs is a man who's finished. A man who leaves slow is telling you he'll be back. Nobody said anything until he was past the second gate. Then Cal Renner spat in the dirt and said 90 days. 88, Eliza said. He counted from Monday. That's not better. No, but it's accurate, and we're going to need accurate. Tobe Whitfield was standing by the water trough with his hat in both hands, looking younger than 19. Is it true? What he said about new management? No, Wyatt said. But he had paper. He had paper, Wyatt agreed. Paper isn't the same as the place. It was a good answer. Eliza watched the crew take it the way men take a good answer from a boss they like. They nodded, and they went back to work, and not one of them believed it. She followed Wyatt into the house. He went straight through the kitchen and into the little room off the back that had been his father's office, and she found him standing at the window with both hands on the sill. Don't, he said, before she could speak. Don't what? Don't tell me we'll find a way. I need about 10 minutes where nobody tells me that. So she didn't. She sat down in the chair by the door and waited, and the clock in the kitchen ticked. And after a while, Wyatt said, without turning around, I've been thinking about selling the north section. You can't. It's the water. I know it's the water. Without the north section, you've got no creek access, and this place is a dry lot with a nice barn. I know, Eliza. He turned around. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm saying it's an idea, and I've got 88 days and no other ideas, and I'd rather stand here and say a stupid thing out loud than sit up at 3 a.m. thinking it alone. She let that settle. All right, she said. And say the rest of them. The rest of what? The stupid ideas. All of them. Get them out where I can look at them. She pulled her notebook out and opened it to a clean page. That's how you find the one that isn't stupid. You don't find it by being clever. You find it by running out of bad ones. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he came and sat down on the edge of his father's desk, and he started listing them. Sell the north section. Sell the herd early next spring at a loss. Borrow from Henderson, who had credit and wouldn't give it. Go to a bank in Harwick, which would want to see the books, which would show them the Shaw note, which would end the conversation. Marry a woman with money, which he said flatly and without looking at her, and which she wrote down without comment because she'd told him to say all of them. Take a loan from a cattle broker at rates that made Shaw's 14% look generous. Let Voss have it and go north again and work for wages. 11 ideas, she wrote them all. That's it, he said. That's everything I've got. Eliza looked at the list. None of these solve the problem, she said. I'm aware. No, listen. None of them solve it because they're all answers to the wrong question. You keep asking how to find $2,800. That's not the problem. She turned the notebook around. Problem is that a man who has spent 15 years stealing land in this county is going to take yours in January. And the reason he can is that nobody has ever made him answer for any of it. $2,800 buys you 1 year. It doesn't buy you a life. So what's the right question? How do we finish him? Eliza said. The room got very quiet. That's not a small thing to say out loud, Wyatt said. I know it isn't. He's got 2 commissioners, 3 lawyers, the bank, and half the association. He's got a surveyor, Eliza said, 1 surveyor. And that surveyor signed his name to every single thing he did. And I don't think Harlan Voss has ever once lain awake worrying about it, because he can't imagine a world where a man like Elias Pike matters. Wyatt was watching her now with an expression she couldn't quite read. You want to go find him. I want to go find him before Voss remembers he exists. Harwick was a 2-day ride, and they did it in a day and a half because Wyatt pushed the horses harder than he should have, and Eliza didn't tell him to stop. Elias Pike's office was a narrow storefront on a side street with a hand-painted sign pike, surveying at Pleasets, and a layer of dust on the glass thick enough to write in. It was locked. It had been locked a while. The barber next door said Pike hadn't opened in 4 months. Said he'd moved out to a place past the stockyards. Said it in the careful way people talk about a man who's come down in the world and might come down further. Place past the stockyards was 2 rooms in a boarding house that smelled like boiled cabbage and old smoke. The woman who ran it took Wyatt's dollar and said Pike was in the back and probably awake by now, and the probably did a great deal of work in that sentence. Elias Pike was 58 years old and looked 70. He had been a big man once, and the frame of it was still there, hung with the sag of a man who had stopped eating regularly some time ago. His hands shook. He was sober, but only in the technical sense that there was nothing in the room to drink. He looked at Wyatt first, then at Eliza. Then he sat down on the edge of his cot and put his face in his hands. "You're from Red Hollow," he said. "Yes," Wyatt said. "Which one are you, the Hendersons?" "Calder." "Calder." Pike laughed, or made a sound in that direction. "I don't think I ever did anything to a Calder." "You did something to a Marlowe," Eliza said. He lifted his head and looked at her properly for the first time. "Thomas Marlowe's East parcel," she said. "Boundary correction, filed in June. 200 feet. Pike's mouth worked. "You're the daughter." "Yes, he was a decent man," Pike said. "Your father. He came to see me once, years back, about a drainage question, and he paid me on the day, and he shook my hand." He rubbed his face. "I remembered that when I signed it. That's a hell of a thing, isn't it? I remembered his handshake, and I signed it anyway." Eliza had prepared herself for a lot of things on the ride to Harwick. She had prepared for a man who would deny it, a man who would threaten them, a man who would be rich and comfortable and laugh in their faces. She had not prepared for this for a broken man who volunteered the guilt before it was even asked for. "Why did you do it?" she said. Pike didn't answer. "Mr. Pike." "Because if I hadn't," he said, "he'd have used the Reyes papers." Wyatt went very still. "What Reyes papers?" he said. Pike looked up at him, and something in Wyatt's voice must have registered, because his eyes narrowed. "Wait," he said. "Calder, Wyatt Calder. You rode for him." 78. "Yes." "You were out at the Reyes place." "Yes." Pike laughed again, and this one was real and terrible. "Then you already know. You were there." He stood up unsteady and went to the window. 40 acres. Family had it 20 years. Old man Reyes had a deed from before the county even existed, and it was a good deed. It was a fine deed. And Voss came to me in July of that year and said the survey was in error, and would I file a correction? "And you did." I said no. Pike's voice cracked on it. "I want that said." I said no, twice, and he went away, and 3 weeks later he came back with a letter. What letter? A letter I wrote in 1871. Pike's shoulders had gone up around his ears. There was a section line up near the county border. Timberland. I was young and I was broke, and a man paid me $40 to put the line where he wanted it instead of where it was. $40. It wasn't even a real property, nobody lived there. Nobody ever will, and I put it in a letter because I was too stupid to do a crooked thing without writing it down. He turned around. Harlan Voss had that letter. Don't ask me how. He's had it since before I knew he existed. And he put it on my desk and he said, "File the Reyes correction, or I'll have your license and 5 years in the territorial prison." The room was so quiet, Eliza could hear the woman downstairs moving pots. "So I filed it," Pike said. And the Reyes family lost their grass, and the boy there was a boy, 16. 17 he came to my office, and he stood right in front of my desk and asked me to explain it to him, and I couldn't. And then it was done, and I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't, Eliza said. No, Pike sat back down heavily, because now he didn't just have the 1871 letter. Now he had the Reyes filing, with my signature on it, a real fraud on a real family in a real county. And every time he wanted another one, he had one more piece of paper to hold over me, and I had one more reason to say yes. He held up his shaking hands. That's how it works. That's the whole mechanism. He never had to pay me $1 after the first one. He just had to keep letting me dig. How many, Wyatt said. How many what? How many filings? Pike looked at the floor. 19, he said. Eliza's pen stopped. 19, she repeated. Over 15 years, some of them small, a water share, a well line. Some of them, he stopped. 9 families lost their places. I know because I made myself learn the names. That was my penance, I suppose. Learning the names and not doing one damned thing about it. Wyatt had not moved. Eliza glanced at him and saw a man standing at the exact edge of something. "Mr. Pike," she said before Wyatt could speak. Do you have copies? Pike looked up. Of the filings, your working copies. Field notes. Anything. They're county documents. The originals are in the recorder's office, and I know where the originals are. I'm asking what's in this room. He stared at her. You keep things in writing, she said. You told me so yourself a minute ago. You said you were too stupid to do a crooked thing without writing it down. She leaned forward. So where is it? Elias Pike sat on that cot for what felt like a full minute. Then he got up and went to the corner and dragged out a battered wooden trunk with a rope tied around it in place of a broken latch. Field books, he said. 31 of them. Every measurement I ever took in that county, in my own hand, dated as I took it. He untied the rope. The originals in the recorder's office say the line runs where Voss wanted it. My field books say where the line actually was. Wyatt made a sound. That's not everything, Pike said. Bottom of the trunk. Under the books, Eliza knelt and dug. It was a bundle of correspondence, tied with string. 9 letters. Everyone on Harlan Voss's stationery, in Harlan Voss's hand, instructing Elias Pike where a line was to be placed, and by what date, with the word correction used every time in a way that fooled nobody who read 2 of them side by side. He wrote to you, Eliza said. He wrote to you. He never once thought I'd keep them, Pike said. That's the part I want you to understand. He didn't think I'd keep them because he didn't think I was a person. I was a signature. You don't worry about what a signature is doing on a Tuesday. Eliza sat back on her heels with 9 letters in her lap and her heart going like a hammer. Mr. Pike, she said. Will you swear to this? They'll prosecute me. Probably. I'm 58 years old, I know. I'd die in there, you might, Eliza said. I'm not going to lie to you about that, and I'm not going to promise you a thing I can't deliver. Here's what I can tell you. If you swear to it, 9 families find out they weren't crazy. And the boy from the Reyes place, wherever he is, hears somebody finally said it out loud. She stood up. And if you don't, you'll sit in this room and drink until it kills you. And Harlan Voss will keep going. And in 15 years, there'll be another man in another rented room with a trunk full of proof he was too frightened to open. Pike didn't answer. You don't have to decide today, Eliza said. But I'd like the field books and the letters. And I'd like to give you a receipt for them, signed by both of us, so that if anything happens to me, you can prove where they went. And if anything happens to you, I can prove where they came from. Pike stared at her. A receipt, he said in writing. Started to laugh. It went on a little too long and ended somewhere close to crying. Thomas Marlowe's girl, he said. He always said you'd be trouble. They rode back with the trunk lashed to a borrowed pack mule, and neither of them said much for the first 10 miles. Then Wyatt said 19. I know. 9 families. I know. He rode a while longer. I helped with one of them. You did. You could say something kinder than that. I could, Eliza said. But you'd know I was managing you. And then you wouldn't trust anything else I said. So no, she shifted her reins. You want kinder? Here's kinder. You didn't have to tell me about the Reyes place. I'd never have found it. You told me anyway, at a moment when telling me could have cost you the only person willing to fight for your ranch. That's not nothing. It doesn't undo it. Nothing undoes it. That's what makes it a real thing instead of a story. She looked over at him. But there's a trunk on that mule, and if we do this right, in about 90 days, a judge is going to read the name Reyes out loud in a courtroom for the first time since '78. That's not undoing. That's the next best thing there is. The barn burned 11 days later. It went up at 2:30 in the morning, and by the time Tobe Whitfield's shouting woke the house, it was already through the roof on the east side where the sizing had been patched with mismatched boards 6 years ago and had been dry as kindling ever since. They got the horses out. That was the only thing that mattered, and they got it done. All 4 of them, Cal going back in twice and coming out the second time on his hands and knees with a rope in his teeth and a 2-year-old filly following him blind. They did not get the trunk out. Eliza remembered the next part in pieces, the way people remember the worst 4 minutes of a year. Running. Somebody grabbing her arm and her tearing loose from it. Wyatt shouting her name in a voice she'd never heard him use. The heat coming off the barn door like a wall you could lean on. She got 8 feet inside. The tack room was on the west end, and the west end was still standing, and the trunk was where she'd left it, because the office in the house had no lock, and the tack room did. She got the rope off. She got the lid up. She got both arms around the field books, 31 of them, and they weighed more than she'd expected. And she took about half of them, because that was all she could carry, and then the roof let go somewhere behind her, with a sound like the world clearing its throat. Cal Renner hit her at a dead run, and took her off her feet and carried her out. They landed in the dirt 20 feet from the door. Eliza came up swinging at him, actually swinging, screaming something she couldn't remember afterward. And Cal took a fist in the jaw and didn't even blink, just held her by both arms and said, "It's gone. Gone, ma'am, it's gone." She had 16 field books. She had lost 15 of them, and the 9 letters had been in the bottom of the trunk under the books, and the bottom of the trunk was under 6 tons of burning roof. Wyatt found her at first light, sitting in the dirt at the edge of the burn, with the 16 books stacked beside her, going through them one at a time, page by page, in the gray light. Her hands were burned across the backs. Not badly. Badly enough, Eliza. 81, she said without looking up. I've got 81 and 82 almost complete. I've got the Dunmore well. I've got the Henderson spring. She turned a page. I don't have 78. 78 was in the first 4 books, and the first 4 books are gone. Stop. I don't have the Reyes survey, and I don't have the letters. Eliza. She stopped. Wyatt crouched down in front of her. He looked at her hands and didn't touch them. Somebody has to say this, he said. So it's going to be me. You ran into a burning building. I know what I did. You ran into a burning building for a box of paper. It wasn't a box of paper, Wyatt. It was... I know what it was. His voice cracked, and that stopped her more than anything he could have said. I know exactly what it was. And I'm telling you that when Cal came out that door with you, and I saw you were breathing, I had a thought, and the thought was I don't care about the ranch. He sat back on his heels. That's not a good thing to find out about yourself at 3 in the morning. Eliza looked at him. That's the most useful thing you've said in a month, she said. And I need you to never say it again. Because if I know you feel that way, I'll start being careful. And I can't afford to be careful. That's a terrible answer. It's an honest one. She closed the field book. Ask me again in January. The county recorder's office in Red Hollow was open from 9 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday. And on the following Tuesday, Eliza rode in and asked the clerk for the boundary correction filings from 1,878. Clerk was gone. There was a new man behind the counter, young, with a clean collar and an apologetic manner. The 1,878 filings had been transferred to the county seat at Harwick for archival, he said, along with 1,877 and 1,879. There'd been an order about it. He showed her the order. It was dated 4 days after the barn burned. When will they come back? I couldn't say, ma'am. Who signed the order? Commissioner Deakins. And where does Commissioner Deakins winter his cattle? Eliza asked. The young man's ears went red, which was answer enough. She rode to Harwick on Thursday. It took her most of 2 days, and she paid for the room out of money she didn't have, and the archive clerk at the county seat, a woman of about 60, with reading glasses on a chain and a manner like a locked door, told her the Red Hollow 1,877 through 1,879 files had never arrived. Never arrived. No, ma'am. They were shipped 9 days ago. They were not received. Eliza put both hands flat on the counter and made herself breathe. May I see the receiving log? That's not a public document. Is there a public document that would show me whether a shipment of county records went missing between 2 county offices? The woman looked at her over the glasses for a long moment. No, she said. And then, in a slightly different voice, there isn't. And I've been in this office 19 years. And I'd like you to know I think that's a disgrace. It was, Eliza thought later, the second best thing that happened that week. The best thing was that she'd copied 4 of those filings by hand in that cold little office in September, word for word, because she couldn't afford the fee for proper copies. Handwritten copies by an interested party weren't evidence. She knew that. Any lawyer in the territory would laugh them out of a room. But they told her exactly what the originals had said. And what the originals had said, she now knew, could be checked against 16 field books written in Elias Pike's hand and dated as he took the measurements. She rode back to Red Hollow with her burned hands wrapped in strips of an old shirt and did arithmetic the whole way. They had 51 days left when she called the second meeting, and this one wasn't in the Calder kitchen, because the Calder kitchen wouldn't hold them. They met in Josephine Pell's barn, 4 miles east of town, because Josephine Pell was a widow of 63 who had buried a husband and 2 brothers and had reached the age where she no longer cared what Harlan Voss thought of her. 19 people came, the Hendersons, Ruth Dunmore with her father, the 3 Ochoa brothers, all of them now, including the one who'd said in September that he'd never set foot in Red Hollow again. 2 families from the North End who'd lost water and never known why. A blacksmith named Orrin Teague, whose brother-in-law had been the Reyes family's neighbor. Cal Renner and Tobe Whitfield, and Cal's wife's sister, who came because Cal came. And Merritt Shaw's own bookkeeper, a nervous man of 40 named Purvis, who had asked to attend through 3 intermediaries and who sat at the very back with his hat in his lap. Eliza stood on a hay bale, because otherwise nobody past the 3rd row could see her. "I'm going to tell you exactly what we have, and exactly what we don't," she said. "And I'd ask you to hear all of it before anybody decides anything, because the second half is worse than the first," she told them. 19 filings over 15 years. 9 families. A surveyor in a rented room in Harwick who was ready to swear to it. 16 field books in Pike's own hand that dated at the time of measurement that could be laid beside the county's records to show exactly where the lines had been moved and by how much. Then she told them the rest. The letters burned. 15 field books burned. The 1,877 through 1,879 county filings vanished between 2 offices under an order signed by a commissioner who wintered 400 head on Voss grass. "So here's where we stand," she said. "We can prove 81 and 82. Dunmore's well, Henderson's spring, the Ochoa transfer, my father's boundary, 4 families, solid." She held up the copied pages. "We cannot prove 78. Not anymore. Which means the Reyes placed the first one. The one that started it is gone." Henderson said, "Then it's 4 families against a man with 3 lawyers." "Yes, that's not enough." "No," Eliza said, "it's not." The barn went quiet. "So I'm going to ask you for 2 things," she said. "And I want you to understand that both of them cost you something real. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because I've been on the wrong end of people pretending my whole life. The first thing is a sworn statement, not an accusation. A statement of fact, dated, witnessed, filed with the circuit court at Harwick, which is outside this county, and outside Harlan Voss's reach. What happened to your land, and when, and whose signature was on the paper. 4 of you can do that today. If more of you can, we're stronger. The second thing is money. Somebody made a noise. $2,800, Eliza said. That's the note Voss bought against the Calder Ranch. Comes due January 15th. If it isn't paid, he takes that place. And if he takes that place before the hearing, then every one of us walks into court as a group of people who already lost. And I'll tell you plainly, a judge treats losers different than he treats a going concern. It shouldn't be true. It's true. You want us to buy his ranch out of trouble, Henderson said. No, Eliza said. I want you to buy 90 days. With what? You know what I've got. You know what any of us have got. I know. She stepped down off the bale. Here's what I'm putting in. My father's east parcel, what's left of it, after Voss took 200 feet, is worth about $400. I've had an offer on it, standing since October. I'm taking it Monday. The barn made a sound. Wyatt came off the wall. No, he said. Wyatt, no. He was across the floor before she could finish. That's your father's. That's the whole reason you're in this. That's right, Eliza said. And what would it be worth to me to keep 40 acres and watch him take everything else? I'd have a field. I'd have a field and I'd stand in it for the rest of my life. She held his eyes. I'm not being noble. I'm being accurate. That parcel is the least valuable thing I own now, and I own more than I did in June, and I'd like you to let me spend it. I can't let you do that. You can't stop me. It's my name on it. She turned back to the barn. 400. That's mine. I need 24 more. Nobody moved. Then Josephine Pell stood up. 600, she said. The barn turned. My husband drank the last of what we had, she said. And I have said so out loud in this county for 4 years, and every one of you has looked at your boots when I did it. But he didn't drink all of it. He didn't know about all of it. She sat back down. 600. And I want it in writing. And I want interest because I'm not a charity, and I've got another 20 years to live if I'm unlucky. 4%, Eliza said. 6.5, done, said Josephine Pell. Ruth Dunmore stood up next. $212. It's what my father had put by for his burying, and he's told me 3 times tonight to say it, so I'm saying it. Old Pete Dunmore raised one hand about 6 inches and let it drop. The Ochoa brothers gave $410 between them, their entire share of the fall sale, which they had been paid 9 days before and had not yet spent, and which the eldest handed over in a leather pouch that had been his father's. Orrin Teague, the blacksmith, gave $90 and said he'd have given more if his wife weren't watching. Tobe Whitfield gave $31, which was everything he had, and got angry when Wyatt tried to refuse it. Cal Renner didn't stand up. He walked over to Wyatt and put an envelope in his hand and said, "Lo, that's $400. It was for the house I'm not going to build. Don't say anything about it, and don't look at me like that." They were at $1,743. They were $1,157 short. Henderson had not said a word. He sat in the 3rd row with his hat between his knees, and everyone in the barn knew it, and slowly the room went quiet around the shape of his silence. "I've got a boy in school in Harwick," he said at last. "I know," Eliza said. "He's the first one in my family. I know that too. If I put in and it fails, he comes home." "Yes." Henderson turned his hat over. "Voss came to my place in November. Did you know that?" "No. Sat in my kitchen and drank my coffee and said he'd carry my paper at the bank personally if things got tight." His jaw worked. I said, "Thank you." I thanked him. My wife stood at the stove and looked at the back of my head, and I sat there and thanked him for offering to hold the rope. He stood up. $1,200, he said. "It's the school money and next year's seed, and I want it understood that if this goes wrong, I'm not going to be gracious about it. I'll say ugly things and I'll mean some of them." "Understood," Eliza said. "And I want my statement filed first. Ahead of yours. If a name's going at the top of that paper, I'd rather it was mine, since I've spent 3 years being the biggest coward in this valley, and I'd like to be done." It took Merritt Shaw 6 days to hear about the barn meeting, and 4 hours after that to ride out to the Calder ranch. He came at dusk, alone, on a bad horse he'd clearly borrowed so as not to be recognized, and he was so frightened he could barely get down out of the saddle. Wyatt met him in the yard and did not offer him the house. "You sold my note," Wyatt said. "I had to." "You sold my note to the man who spent 6 months cutting my fences." "Wyatt, say it different. Say something I haven't already worked out for myself at 3 in the morning." Merritt Shaw was 49 years old, a soft man in a good coat, and he stood in that yard in the cold and started to come apart. "He owns the bank," he said. "He does not own the bank. You run the bank. He owns 61% of the paper in it." Shaw's voice went up. "Do you understand what that means? 61%. If he pulls his deposits and calls in what he's guaranteed, Red Hollow Savings closes in 11 days, and every account in this valley goes with it. Yours Henderson's, the church fund. Ada Greer's boarding house money." He was shaking. "He came to me in October and said, 'Sell me the Calder private note or I'll do it.' And I sat there and I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said 1 ranch or the whole town." "That's a fine speech," Wyatt said. "It might even be true. It doesn't change that you set the trap in the first place. 14% merit. Unsecured. You knew what you were handing me." "I know what I did. Do you?" "I've known for 20 months, Shaw said, "and I haven't slept right for 18 of them. And my bookkeeper went to a meeting in a barn last week and didn't think I'd notice, and I didn't stop him." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I let him go. That's all the courage I have, Wyatt. I let my bookkeeper go to a meeting." Eliza had come out onto the porch. "She'd heard most of it, Mr. Shaw," she said. He looked up at her like a man who'd been waiting for the worst half of the conversation. "When Harlan Voss bought that note from you," she said, "did he pay you for it?" Shaw blinked. "What? Did money change hands? Did you receive $2,800 or some discounted figure in exchange for the assignment of that note?" "No, not cash. He credited it against a deposit guarantee he holds." "So there's a bank instrument," Eliza said. "A ledger entry. Somewhere in your books, there is a line showing that Harlan Voss acquired a private debt instrument using bank-held guarantees as consideration." Shaw's face changed. "That's a bank transaction," Eliza said. "Not a private one. That means it's subject to the territorial banking examiner, and it means that when Harlan Voss forecloses on this ranch in January, he isn't a private lender collecting a debt. He's an officer-adjacent party using depositor-backed instruments to acquire real property from a customer of the same bank. The yard was silent. Is that a crime? Wyatt said. I don't know, Eliza said. I'm not a lawyer. I've never once pretended to be one, and I'm not going to start now with a man's ranch on the line. She came down the steps. But I know it's a question. And I know that a circuit judge who's already looking at 19 fraudulent surveys is going to be very interested in a question about the bank. She stopped in front of Merritt Shaw. Here's what I want, she said. Not the ledger. I'm not going to ask you to steal from your own bank. You'd say no, and you'd be right to. And then you'd go tell him we asked. She kept her voice level. I want you to answer a subpoena. That's all. If the court asks you what that entry says, I want you to tell the truth. You don't have to volunteer anything. You don't have to be brave. You just have to not lie under oath. Shaw stared at her. That's it, he said. That's it. You rode all the way to Harwick. You burned your hands. You talked 19 people into emptying their pockets in a barn. And what you want from me is that I don't perjure myself. Mr. Shaw, Eliza said, in this valley, that's a considerable ask. He laughed. It was a wet, wrecked sound. And it went on a moment too long, and when it stopped, he was crying and not bothering to hide it. I'll answer the subpoena, he said. Elias Pike swore his deposition before a circuit judge in Harwick on the 4th of January, and it took 9 hours, and Eliza was not permitted in the room. She sat on a bench in the corridor for all 9 of them. At 4:30, the door opened, and Pike came out between 2 men, and he was shaking so hard he could barely walk, and he saw her and stopped. They're charging me, he said. I know. 19 counts. The prosecutor said 19 counts. Eliza stood up. Mr. Pike, I told them all of it. He was gripping the doorframe. Everything 19. And when he asked me why I finally came forward after 15 years, he stopped, swallowed. I told him a woman came to my room and offered me a receipt. They took him down the corridor. At the stairs, he twisted around and called back, in a voice that carried the whole length of the building, Marlowe. Tell the Reyes boy I said his name. The hearing was set for the 12th of January. The note came due on the 15th. Harlan Voss's attorneys moved twice to have the matter continued to the spring term, and both motions were denied, and the second denial came with a line from the bench about the court's disinclination to accommodate delay in a matter involving county records that had gone missing in transit. They had $1,743, plus Henderson's $1,200, which came to $2,943, which was enough for the note, with $143 left over. And Eliza had sold her father's parcel on the 4th of December for $380, because that was what it actually fetched, and not the $400 she'd promised. She had gone out to it alone on the last morning. 40 acres of nothing much. Grass and a drainage creek and a line of fence posts her father had set with his own hands, in a summer she was too young to remember. She had stood there about 10 minutes. She had not cried, because she had a great deal to do that day. She had said, out loud, to nobody, I hope you'd think it was worth it. I think it's worth it. Then she'd walked back to the road. On the morning of the 12th of January, the circuit courtroom in Harwick held 91 people, and 38 of them had ridden 2 days from Red Hollow to be there. They filled every bench. When the benches were full, they stood along the walls, and when the walls were full, the bailiff opened the doors and let them stand in the corridor, and the corridor filled too. Josephine Pell sat in the second row in a black dress she'd last worn to a funeral. Ruth Dunmore had brought her father in his wheeled chair and set him in the aisle where he could see. The 3 Ochoa brothers sat together and did not speak to anyone. Orrin Teague had shut his forge for 2 days. Ada Greer had closed the boarding house, which she had not done in 11 years, and had ridden up with Clement Pryor of the dry goods store, who had spent the entire journey working up to an apology and had not managed to deliver it. Merritt Shaw sat alone at the end of a bench, gray-faced, with his ledger book in a satchel between his feet. Tobe Whitfield had never been in a courthouse and kept taking his hat off and putting it back on. Cal Renner sat with arms folded and stared at the back of Harlan Voss's head for 2 straight hours without once looking away. Harlan Voss came in at 10 minutes to 9 with 3 attorneys and sat down at the front and did not turn around. Eliza sat behind the petitioner's table with 16 field books stacked in front of her and her burned hands folded on top of them. Wyatt sat beside her. Say something, he said low. Like what? Anything. You've been quiet since Tuesday and it's making me nervous. Eliza looked at the room. at Josephine Pell's black dress and Pete Dunmore's wheeled chair and Tobe's hat going up and down. At Henderson, 3 rows back, sitting beside his wife with his jaw set like a man in front of a firing squad who has decided not to ask for a blindfold. The back of the room, where a man of about 30 had come in late and taken a place standing against the wall, dark-haired, weather-beaten, unknown to anyone in Red Hollow, holding a folded paper in one hand. I was thinking about June, Eliza said. What about it? He threw a letter in the dirt at my feet on the main street of Red Hollow, in front of 40 people, and every single one of them laughed. She watched the judge's door. And I remember thinking, nobody in this town is ever going to look at me and see anything but a woman who picks things up off the ground. Eliza, I'm not sad about it, she said. I'm telling you what I thought. And I was wrong, and I've been wrong about a lot of things this year. And the thing I was most wrong about is that I thought I was the only one. Turned her head and looked at the 91 people behind her. There were 9 families, Wyatt 9, and every single one of them thought they were alone too. That's the trick. That's the whole trick. He never had to beat all of us. He just had to make sure we never got in the same room. The bailiff came through the side door. All rise. 91 people stood, and the sound of it went up into the rafters like something breaking loose, and Harlan Voss turned around in his chair for the first time that morning and looked back at the courtroom and saw of every face in Red Hollow that he had ever counted on to stay quiet, standing up, looking straight at him. The judge was a small, dry man of about 60 named Amos Corley, and he came in without ceremony, sat down, put on his glasses, and looked at the crowd over the top of them for a long moment before he said anything at all. I'd remind everyone standing in the corridor that this is a court of law and not a horse auction, he said. Sit down if you can find a place. Be quiet if you can't. 91 people sat mostly. This matter comes before me as a consolidated petition, Corley said, brought by 6 named petitioners, alleging fraudulent alteration of county survey records in Red Hollow County over a period of approximately 15 years, and further alleging that certain property transfers arising from those alterations are void. He looked at the petitioner's table. Mr. Ashcombe, you're for the petitioners. The lawyer stood. He was 34 years old, worked out of 2 rooms in Harwick, and had taken the case on a fee arrangement that Eliza had constructed over 4 days, and which would pay him almost nothing if they lost, and a percentage of recovered value if they won. He had said yes on the second day. Eliza had asked him why, and he'd said, honestly, that no one had ever brought him a case with 16 field books in it before. I am, Your Honor. And Mr. Falk, you're for the respondent. The lead of Harlan Voss's 3 attorneys rose. He was a silver-haired man from the territorial capital who had ridden 200 miles to be there and whose suit cost more than Tobe Whitfield would earn in 3 years. I am, Your Honor. And before we proceed, I'd renew my objection to the consolidation of 6 separate matters, spanning 15 years into a single hearing. Each of these properties involves distinct facts, distinct parties. You've renewed it. It's noted, it's denied. Corley didn't look up. Sit down, Mr. Falk, Your Honor. With respect, the prejudicial effect of presenting 6 unrelated. Mr. Falk, Corley took his glasses off. You've come a long way, and I'm sure you're expensive, so I'm going to explain this once, and then we'll get on with it. Petitioner's theory is that these matters are not unrelated. That's the entire question in front of me. If I sever them, I've decided the case before hearing it. I'm not going to do that. Sit down. Falk sat down. Eliza let out a breath she'd been holding since December. Ashcombe started with Pete Dunmore because Eliza had insisted. She had argued about it with the lawyer for an hour. Ashcombe had wanted to open with the field books, the documents, the arithmetic, the clean, irrefutable thing. Eliza had said no. Why not, he'd asked. Because a judge sits through paper all day long. Paper's his whole life. If you hand him paper first, he reads it like a professional and files it away like a professional, and he's thinking about lunch by page 9. She'd tap the table. Give him a man in a chair who can't hold a pen anymore. Then give him the paper. Then he reads the paper differently. That's not how you build a case. It's how you build a day, Eliza had said. And this is one day, and we get one of them. So Ruth Dunmore wheeled her father to the front of the courtroom and set the brake. And Judge Corley, who did not have to came down off the bench and stood beside the chair so the old man wouldn't have to raise his voice. Pete Dunmore was 81 years old. His speech had gone thick after the second stroke, and he had to stop between sentences, and the courtroom held 91 people who did not make a sound for 11 minutes. He said he dug his well in 1859 with a man named Farrell who was dead now. He said the well came in sweet at 22 feet and stayed sweet for 22 years. In the spring of 1881, a man from Voss's office came out and offered him $900 for the Eastern 40, and he said no because his wife was buried on it. He said in September of 1881, a surveyor came and put stakes in and went away. He said in November the well came up brackish. He said he'd hauled water in a barrel on a cart for the next 4 years, 3 miles each way, until his legs quit, and then his daughter had hauled it. Ashcombe asked him one question at the end. "Mr. Dunmore, did anyone ever explain to you why the well went bad?" The old man worked his mouth for a while. "No, sir," he said. "Nobody ever explained nothing to me. That's what I come here for. I come here to get it explained." Falk declined to cross-examine. He was too smart to cross-examine. But Eliza, watching the jury box empty, since this was a bench trial, but she watched it anyway out of habit from a courtroom she'd never sat in, watched Judge Corley instead, and saw him take his glasses off and rub the bridge of his nose and put them back on, and knew that Ashcombe would be arguing to a different man for the rest of the day than he'd have been arguing to at 9 o'clock. Then came the paper. It took 4 hours, and it was as dry as Eliza had promised it would be, and it was devastating. Ashcombe laid Elias Pike's field books beside the county's filed records, one property at a time. He did the Dunmore well, first Pike's field notes from September 1881, in Pike's hand, dated, showing the boundary at the creek bend, 340 feet east of where the filed survey placed it. Then the filed survey itself, signed and stamped 6 weeks later. Then a hydrologist from the Territorial University, whom Ashcombe had gotten for expenses only, because the man was 61 and had opinions about groundwater, and no one had asked him about them in a decade. He explained, at length and with diagrams, what happens to a shallow well when a stock tank is sunk 400 feet up gradient of it in the same aquifer. In your opinion, Ashcombe said, was the Dunmore well contaminated by natural causes? In my opinion, the Dunmore well was contaminated by 200 head of cattle standing directly above it, the hydrologist said, which is not a natural cause. It's a decision. Falk objected. Corley overruled him. Then Henderson Spring. Then the Ochoa transfer, with the eldest brother on the stand saying, in careful English he'd practiced for a week, that his father had signed a paper he could not read after being told by a man in an office that the alternative was a lawsuit he could not afford. Then Thomas Marlowe's East Parcel. Eliza had not intended to testify. Ashcombe had put her on the list as a formality, and she had assumed she'd be spared. But when the moment came, he called her name, and she stood up, and her hands still pink and tight across the backs where the skin had healed wrong were shaking so badly that she had to press them flat against her skirt. She had faced down a cattlemen's association. She had stood on a hay bale and asked 19 people to empty their pockets. She had walked into a room in a boarding house in Harwick and asked a ruined man to end himself. She had not, in 29 years, ever been asked to speak in a room where the law was listening. State your name for the court. Eliza Marlowe. Miss Marlowe, are you the daughter of Thomas Marlowe, deceased? I am. I show you Petitioner's Exhibit 19. Do you recognize it? She looked at it. It was the letter. The actual letter, recovered from the county's own file. The one Harlan Voss had torn open and dropped in the dirt on the main street of Red Hollow in June. Yes, she said. What is it? It's the notification of the corrected survey on my father's parcel. When did you first see this document? The 19th of June. Under what circumstances? Eliza looked up. She could see Harlan Voss from the witness chair. He was sitting with one arm over the back of his seat, entirely at ease, the way a man sits at a performance he's already read the reviews of. Mr. Voss took it out of my hand on the street, outside the land office, she said. He opened it, he read it, then he dropped it on the ground at my feet and told the men with him that it didn't matter what a washerwoman thought. Falk was up. Objection, relevance. Whatever unpleasantness passed between. Overruled. Your Honor, the manner in which a notice was delivered has no bearing on. Mr. Falk, Corley said, the petitioners have alleged a 15-year pattern of conduct. Conduct includes conduct. Sit down. Ashcombe waited a beat. Miss Marlowe, Why do you think Mr. Voss did that in the street rather than mailing you the notice? Objection. Calls for speculation, sustained. Ashcombe nodded, unbothered, because he had gotten what he wanted, which was for every person in that room to spend the next 4 seconds answering the question in their own head. Nothing further, he said. Falk crossed her. Eliza had known he would. Ashcombe had spent 2 evenings preparing her for it and had told her the same thing 4 times. He's not going to attack the evidence. He is going to attack you. Let him. Falk stood up slowly, buttoned his coat, and smiled at her with what looked a great deal like kindness. Miss Marlowe, you've had quite a year, yes. In June you were employed at a dry goods store. That's right. And in July you took a position at the Calder Ranch, which is owned by Mr. Wyatt Calder, who sits at your table. Yes. You live on that property. I do. In what capacity exactly? Your position doesn't appear on any employment record I could find. There's no title, no formal role. I keep the books and I manage the operation. And who determined that you were qualified to manage a cattle operation, Miss Marlowe? What agricultural training have you had? What formal education? None. Falk let it sit. So the answer is that Mr. Calder decided you were qualified. That's right. A man who had never spoken to you before June, who was in severe financial distress, who was, by his own records, approximately $4,000 from losing his family's property, decided that an unmarried woman with no training and no credentials should run his ranch. Falk turned toward the bench. Your Honor, I raise this not to embarrass the witness, but because the entirety of this petition rests on documents that were collected, transported, and in several cases hand-copied by this woman, whose relationship to the outcome is. Say it, Eliza said. The courtroom went dead quiet. Miss Marlowe Ashcombe started. No, let him say it. She turned to Falk. You've been circling it for 4 minutes. You want to say that I'm sleeping with him. Say it out loud in front of these people so they can hear how it sounds coming out of a man who charges $30 an hour. Miss Marlowe. Corley's gavel came down once. You will not address counsel directly. You will answer questions and nothing else. Am I understood? Eliza sat back. Her face was burning. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Falk, you will ask questions and not make speeches. If you have an allegation, make it plainly and support it, or move on. Falk inclined his head with perfect courtesy. Miss Marlowe, do you stand to benefit financially if this petition succeeds? Yes. The answer was quick enough that Falk actually paused. You do. My father's parcel would be restored to its original boundary. That's about 200 feet by 1,200, which is worth somewhere between $80 and $110, depending on the season. So you have a financial interest in this outcome. I had one, Eliza said. I sold the parcel on the 4th of December for $380. The buyer's name is on the deed at the recorder's office in Red Hollow, assuming that particular file hasn't also gone missing between 2 county buildings. Somebody in the back of the room laughed. Corley's gavel came down again, but he didn't put much into it. You sold it, Falk said. I did. Why? Objection, said Ashcombe. I'll allow it, Corley said. Answer the question. Eliza looked at Falk. Because the money went to pay the note, Mr. Voss bought against the Calder Ranch, she said. The one that comes due on Thursday. I sold my father's land to keep that place standing until today, and so did 19 other people. And if you'd like their names, I have them written down, because I write everything down, which is apparently the most suspicious thing about me. Falk did not ask another question about the parcel. He tried 3 more lines and got nothing useful from any of them, and then he made the mistake that Ashcombe had told her he'd make if he got frustrated. Miss Marlowe, isn't it true that you have pursued the matter for 6 months, not out of concern for these families, but out of personal animosity toward my client, arising from a single unpleasant encounter in a public street? Eliza thought about it for a moment. She actually thought about it, which was not what Falk had expected. Partly, she said. The courtroom shifted. I'm sorry? You asked if it was animosity. Some of it is. I'd be lying if I said otherwise, and I'd rather not lie in here. She kept her hands flat on the rail. He humiliated me in front of my whole town, and I've thought about it nearly every day since. That's true. I'd like it not to be true. It's true. Falk stood there. But you're wrong about the shape of it, Eliza said. You think I went looking for a way to hurt him. I didn't. I went looking for a way to keep 40 acres. And every single time I turned over a rock, there was another family under it. 9 of them. I stopped counting my own grievance somewhere around the 4th one, because by then it was the smallest thing on the list. So you admit— I admit I'm not a saint, Eliza said. I never claimed to be. I'm a woman who got angry and then found out she was right. And I'd point out to you, sir, that those two things can happen to the same person on the same afternoon. Falk sat down. They broke for the noon recess, and Eliza got as far as the corridor before her legs quit on her. She sat down on a bench with her head against the wall. Wyatt found her there 90 seconds later. Don't say anything, she said. I wasn't going to. You've got a face on. I've got a face because you just told a territorial attorney to say it out loud, and I've been trying for 4 minutes to figure out whether that was the bravest thing I ever saw or the worst mistake of the whole case. It was both, Eliza said. Ashcomb's furious. Ashcomb's is not furious, he said. Ashcombe went out to the alley and stood there laughing for a full minute with his hand over his mouth so nobody would hear him, Wyatt said. I watched him do it. Eliza opened one eye. Ada Greer came down the corridor with a paper packet of snitches, and Clement Pryor trailing behind her like a man being marched somewhere. Eat, Ada said, and put the packet in Eliza's lap, and then stood back and looked at her for a moment. Honey, don't. I was going to say I was wrong in September, and I'd like it noted. Noted, Eliza said. Clement Pryor cleared his throat. He was 66 and had run the dry goods store for 31 years and had never in his life said a hard thing to anybody's face. He came to see me, he said. In June, Voss said he'd move his account and his cousin's account and the association's stock order if I kept you on. He was looking at the floor. I've told myself for 6 months that I couldn't afford it. That's true. It's also true that I didn't try. I didn't even try, Eliza. I just did what he said, and then I made up a reason afterward, and I've been living in that reason ever since. Eliza looked at him. She had been angry about it for a long time. She was surprised to find that most of the anger had gone somewhere, and she couldn't locate it. You gave me 2 weeks' notice when you didn't have to, she said. You could have done it on a Friday, and I'd have found out from the till. A small thing. It's the thing you did. She held out the sandwich packet. Sit down and eat half of this. I can't manage it. He sat. The afternoon belonged to Merritt Shaw, and it nearly went wrong. He took the stand looking like a man walking to a scaffold, and for the first 10 minutes he gave answers so hedged and so qualified that Ashcombe had to ask 3 questions to get one fact. Then Falk objected to the entire line of inquiry as beyond the scope of the petition, and Corley called both lawyers up, and there was 4 minutes of murmuring at the bench, and Eliza sat gripping the edge of the table hard enough to hurt her hands. Corley sent them back. The witness will answer, he said. Mr. Shaw, I'll put it to you directly, since counsel seems to be having trouble. On or about the 20th of October, did Harlan Voss acquire from you a private promissory note against the Calder property? He did, Your Honor. What consideration did he give you? Shaw was silent. Mr. Shaw, he credited it, Shaw said, against a deposit guarantee held by Red Hollow Savings. Corley took his glasses off. Say that again, he said. He gave me no cash, Your Honor. He instructed the bank to reduce the balance of a guarantee obligation he holds against bank deposits in the amount of the note. Shaw's voice was thin, but it did not break. It's entered in the general ledger as an offset. Page 406. I have the book. You brought the book. It's in the satchel at my seat, Your Honor. I brought it because I thought I might be asked, and I decided on the ride up that if I was asked, I was going to answers, because I've spent 20 months not answering, and it hasn't made me any happier. Falk was on his feet. Your Honor, the internal accounting practices of a private bank are not. Mr. Falk, sit down before I have you sit down. Corley turned to the bailiff. Get the book. They got the book. Corley read page 406 for a long time. Then he read it again. Then he set it down and looked out at the courtroom over the top of his glasses. Mr. Ashcombe, he said, is it the petitioner's position that this transaction is relevant to the pattern alleged? It is, Your Honor. It's the same method. He does not buy property. He acquires the instruments that control property, and he acquires them using leverage rather than money, and then he waits. And Mr. Falk, what is the respondent's position? Falk said, carefully, that a lawful assignment of a debt instrument, however unusual its consideration, is not evidence of fraud in a survey filed 8 years earlier. That's a fair point, Corley said. It's also not what I asked. I asked what your position is on the transaction. Falk hesitated a fraction too long. "I need to consult with my client, Your Honor." "I imagine you would," Corley said. It was 4:40 in the afternoon when Ashcombe called Elias Pike. They brought him in from the side door with a deputy on either arm. And he had been in custody 9 days, and he looked better than he had in the boarding house, which said everything about the boarding house. Falk fought it. He fought it for 20 minutes. A man under indictment on 19 counts, testifying against the party his own testimony implicated, with every conceivable motive to shift blame. Falk was good, and he was right about most of it, and Corley let him say all of it, and then allowed the testimony anyway. "His credibility is a matter for the finder of fact," Corley said. "I am the finder of fact. I'll manage." Pike swore the oath in a voice that carried. Ashcombe took him through it slowly. 19 filings. 9 families, 15 years. The mechanism, the 1,871 letter. The $40. The way a man is caught once and then held forever by the thing he did while being caught. And then Ashcombe said, "Mr. Pike, you gave a deposition on the 4th of January in which you described 19 instances. Are you aware that the letters you referenced in that deposition, 9 items of correspondence on Mr. Voss's stationery were destroyed in a fire at the Calder Ranch in November?" "I am." "And that 15 of your 31 field books were destroyed in the same fire?" "I am." Objection, Falk said. "There's been no finding as to the cause of that fire, and counsel's framing invites." "Stained as to cause," Corley said. "The fact of the fire and the loss of documents is established." "Move on." Ashcombe moved on. He walked up Pike through the 16 surviving books, page by page, dated entry by dated entry. And then at 6:04, with the light going gray in the high windows, and 91 people who had not eaten since noon, Falk stood up to cross-examine and said, "Mr. Pike, you've testified about 19 filings. But of those 19, this court has documentary corroboration for how many? 6? 7? 6, said 6. And the remaining 13 exist solely in the memory of a man facing 19 felony counts who has every reason on earth to enlarge the story." "Yes," Pike said. Falk paused, thrown by the agreement. "You concede that?" "I concede that a man in my position has every reason to lie," Pike said. "I'd concede more than that. I'd concede that I have lied. I lied on paper 19 times for 15 years, and every one of those lies is in a county building somewhere with my signature under it. I am, on the evidence, one of the least trustworthy men in this territory." He gripped the rail. "That's exactly why he chose me. He didn't need a man nobody would believe. He needed a man who couldn't afford to be believed." "Move to strike as non-responsive denied," Corley said. The man at the back of the courtroom came forward at 6:20. He had been standing against the wall since 9 in the morning. He had not spoken to anyone. Eliza had noticed him 3 times, and each time had assumed he was somebody's cousin from Harwick. He walked up the center aisle with the folded paper in his hand and stopped at the rail, and the bailiff moved to intercept him, and Judge Corley raised one finger, and the bailiff stopped. "Sir," Corley said, "this is not a public comment proceeding." "I know it, Your Honor. I don't want to say anything." The man's voice was low and careful, and he had a bad scar across the back of one hand. "I want to give something to the court, and then I'll sit down and be quiet." "What is it?" "It's a deed." The courtroom did not make a sound. "Whose deed?" "My father's," the man said. "Ignacio Reyes. 40 acres on Bitter Creek in Red Hollow County. Recorded in 1858, before the county was a county, in the old territorial book at Fort Alden." He unfolded it with hands that were not entirely steady. "I've had it in a saddlebag for 8 years. I heard about the hearing from a blacksmith in Red Hollow named of Teague. His brother-in-law was our neighbor." Wyatt Calder stood up. He did it without thinking about it, and half the courtroom turned to look at him. And he stood there in front of 91 people and could not seem to make himself sit back down. The man at the rail looked at him. "You're Calder," he said. "Yes, you were one of the 4, yes," Wyatt said. Nobody breathed. "You moved our cattle off the North Grass in October of 78, the man said. "I was 17. I remember all 4 of you. I remember your face better than the other 3 because you were the one who wouldn't look at me." Wyatt's mouth moved. Nothing came out of it for a second. "I know," he said. "That's it? You know? I don't have anything better than that." Wyatt's voice was raw and ugly, and it carried to the back wall. "I've had 8 years to come up with something better, and I never did. I did it. I took wages for it. And when I went to Harwick in October to find the surveyor, I went partly for my ranch, and partly because I have not been able to sleep straight through a night since I was 23. That's not much of an apology. It isn't one, Wyatt said. I'm not going to stand in a courtroom in front of your father's deed and ask you for something. You don't owe me an absolution, and I'd think less of you if you handed one out. The man, Tomas Reyes, as the record would show him, looked at Wyatt Calder for a long moment. Then he turned back to the bench and held out the deed. Your Honor, he said. I don't know if this is worth anything after 8 years. I'm not a lawyer, and I couldn't afford one when it mattered. But I heard there was a hearing where somebody was finally going to say out loud what happened in that valley, and I rode 4 days, and I'd like this in front of you, whether it helps or not. Corley took the deed. He read it in silence for 2 full minutes. Then he said in a voice that had gone very flat, Mr. Ashcombe, Mr. Falk. Approach. They approached. Corley turned the document toward them and put one finger on the lower right corner and said something too quietly for the room to hear. Falk went white. Eliza would spend a long time afterward trying to describe the exact quality of that whiteness to people who hadn't been there. It wasn't fear. It was the particular pallor of a professional man realizing that his client has been lying to him specifically, for money, for months. Ashcombe came back to the table and sat down and did not look at Eliza. What? She whispered. The 1858 deed carries a witness signature, he said. Territorial Land Office, Fort Alden. So the 1878 correction, Pike filed states, in its own preamble, that no prior instrument of record exists for the parcel. Ashcombe's hands were flat on the table. That's not a survey error. A survey error is a measurement. That's a representation of fact in a filing, signed by the surveyor, drafted by counsel. He finally looked at her. Somebody wrote that sentence, and it wasn't Elias Pike, because Pike doesn't draft preambles, and the preamble is in the same hand as 3 of the letters in his trunk. The letters burned. 6 of them burned, Ashcombe said. You pulled the field books out. But you also had my copy of the deposition exhibits, and Pike read 2 of those letters into the record on the 4th of January, word for word, under oath, before anyone knew there was a Reyes deed in a saddlebag in a stable 400 miles from here. Judge Corley recessed at 7 o'clock and reconvened at 9 the following morning, and when he came in there were more people in the courtroom than the day before, because word had gotten out and half of Harwick had come to watch. Falk moved for a continuance. It was denied. Falk moved to withdraw as counsel. Corley looked at him over the glasses for a long moment. On what grounds, Mr. Falk? Professional grounds, Your Honor. Are you telling me you've developed an ethical conflict overnight? I'm telling you I'd like to withdraw, Your Honor. I imagine you would, Corley said for the second time in 2 days. Denied. You'll sit there and represent your client, and if you have something to report to the territorial bar, you may do it on Monday like everyone else. Harlan Voss did not testify. That was the thing that Eliza had not expected, and the thing she thought about for years afterward. She had built the entire day in her head around the moment when he took the stand, around what she would feel, watching him swear an oath and then lie under it, and whether she would be able to keep her face still. He never went up. His attorneys rested without calling him, which was correct as a matter of strategy, and which every single person in that courtroom understood as an answer. He sat at the front table with one arm over the back of his chair for 6 hours. And at the end of it, when Corley began to read, Harlan Voss did not turn around. The findings took 40 minutes to deliver. Corley found that 6 of the surveys were fraudulently altered and voided each of them. He restored the boundaries of the Dunmore, Henderson, Ochoa, and Marlowe parcels to their original lines, and ordered the county recorder to refile the corrections at county expense. He found that the 1,878 Reyes filing contained a knowing material misrepresentation and referred the matter with the deed, the preamble, and a comparison of the handwriting to Pike's deposition exhibits to the Territorial Attorney General's Office for criminal investigation of persons other than the surveyor. He found that the October transfer of the Calder note constituted a transaction of sufficient irregularity that he enjoined its enforcement pending review by the Territorial Banking Examiner, and he set that review for the spring term. He declined to find a 15-year conspiracy, because the evidence for 13 of the 19 filings rested on Pike's uncorroborated word, Inslee said plainly that a court could not build a conspiracy out of a confessed forger's memory. And then he set his papers down. I want to add something for the record, he said, which is not a finding and which counsel may object to, if they like. Nobody objected. I have sat on this bench for 19 years. In that time, I have handled perhaps 40 land matters out of Red Hollow County, and I have signed off on most of them without troubling myself because the paper was in order, and the paper is what I'm given. He took his glasses off and folded them. The paper in this county has not been in order for 15 years. It has been in order looking, which is a different thing, and I did not catch it, and no one asked me to catch it, and that is not entirely a defense. It took a woman with no legal training, no money, and no standing to catch it. She did it by writing things down and by walking 9 miles of creek and by asking people questions that nobody had bothered to ask them. That is not a compliment to her. It's an indictment of the rest of us, and I include this court in it. He put the glasses in his pocket. We're adjourned. The sound the room made was not a cheer. Eliza had imagined a cheer. What actually happened was that 91 people stood up at once and started talking, all of them, at full volume, and Ruth Dunmore knelt down beside her father's chair with both hands on his knees and her forehead against his shoulder. And old Pete Dunmore stared straight ahead at the empty bench with an expression that no one who saw it ever quite described. Josephine Pell walked to the front, shook Ashcomb's hand, said, "You'll be sending me a bill, and I'll be reading it closely," and walked out. Henderson sat where he was for a long time. His wife had both her hands wrapped around one of his. When he finally stood up, he came over to Eliza and stopped in front of her and couldn't find anything to say, and after about 4 seconds he put out his hand, and she took it and he shook it once, hard, and left without a word. Tobe Whitfield whooped in the corridor and got told off by a bailiff. Cal Renner did not move from his seat until Harlan Voss stood up. Then Cal stood up too, and he did not say anything, and he did not step into the aisle. He just stood there, arms folded, and let Voss walk past him, and looked at him the entire way. Voss walked out of that courthouse through a corridor lined with people from his own valley, and not one of them spoke to him. At the door he stopped. He turned around, and he found Eliza in the crowd, and he looked at her. He didn't say anything. He put his hat on and went out into the street. She thought about that look for a long time afterward. She never landed on a good word for it. It wasn't hatred. She'd been hated before and knew what it looked like. It was closer to the expression of a man doing arithmetic and not liking the total. They got back to Red Hollow on the 15th of January, which was the day the note came due, and which no longer meant anything, and Wyatt Calder stood in his yard, looking at the burned foundation of his barn. 6 of 19, he said. I know, he's not finished. No, he's got money, he's got the commissioners, and Corley didn't find the conspiracy. Wyatt kicked at a charred board. In 6 months, he'll have new lawyers and a new story, and he'll start again. Probably, Eliza said. And we'll be here. That's not a plan. It's not supposed to be a plan. It's a fact. She sat down on the water trough. Wyatt, I have never once told you this was going to end with him ruined and everybody happy. I've told you what we could get and what it would cost. We got 6. 6 families found out they weren't crazy. The Attorney General has the Reyes preamble. The banking examiner has Shaw's ledger. That's not a victory, it's a position, and it's a better position than any of us have been in since '78. Wyatt was quiet. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. What Reyes? Standing there with that deed. 8 years in a saddlebag, he rubbed his face. He didn't ride 4 days because he thought he'd win anything. He rode 4 days because somebody was finally going to say his father's name in a room where it counted. That's right. That's a small thing to ride 4 days for. It's the only thing anybody rides 4 days for, Eliza said. The town changed slowly and unevenly, and not in the way stories usually tell it. Some of it was immediate. Clement Pryor put a sign in his window on the 18th of January offering credit to any family named in the petition, which cost him money and which he never mentioned to anyone. Ada Greer told the story in her dining room every night for a month to anyone who'd sit still, and improved it each time, until by March, the version circulating in Red Hollow had Eliza carrying all 31 field books out of a burning barn while the roof came down behind her. Eliza corrected it twice. Then she gave up. Some of it was slower and uglier. 11 men had voted against Wyatt in that association meeting in the fall, and 8 of them still wouldn't meet his eye in the street. 2 families who'd taken Voss money in the 80s left the valley entirely rather than face the questions. There were people in Red Hollow who decided, having watched the whole thing, that the real lesson was that it had all been very unpleasant and best not spoken of. And there was a third kind of change, which Eliza noticed first in February and did not know what to do with. People started asking her things. Not about the case, about their land. A man she'd never met came out to the Calder ranch and asked with his hat in his hands whether she'd look at a water agreement his brother had signed. A widow from the North End sent a letter asking what a fair lease rate was for 80 acres of bottom grass. Orrin Teague's wife wanted to know how to read a deed. She answered all of them. It took hours she didn't have. She started keeping a second notebook just for other people's questions, and by April there were 61 entries in it. In March, Carl Renner came into the kitchen and stood there until she looked up. "There's 4 men in the yard," he said. "Whose?" "Nobody's." "That's the point. They rode in looking for work, and they asked for you." He scratched his jaw. "Not for Wyatt. For you." Eliza put her pen down. "What did you tell them?" "I told them to wait." Cal shifted. "Ma'am, I'm going to say a thing, and then I'm going to go back outside, and we'll neither of us mention it again." "All right." In June, I stood into that yard and asked what part of this outfit you were going to help with. I've thought about that question a fair amount since. He looked at the wall behind her head. "I was 59 years old, and I'd worked for 2 men my whole life, and I thought I knew what the shape of a ranch was. And you came out here with a notebook and about $11, and you rebuilt the shape of it, and I fought you on near every piece. You didn't fight me on the north section. I fought you on the north section for 4 days before I fetched the Ochoa boys. You fetched them, though. That's what I'm getting at." Cal finally looked at her. "I'd like you to know that when I'm gone, and I'm 60 this year, so that's a real sentence, and not a figure of speech I'd like it, understood, that I knew what I was looking at by the end. Not at the start, I was a fool at the start, but by the end." He went out. Eliza sat in the kitchen for a while and did not go to the window. In April, Wyatt Calder did something that Red Hollow talked about for the next 20 years. The Cattlemen's Association met the second Tuesday of the month in the back room of the Palace Hotel, same as always, and there were 34 men there because attendance had gone up considerably since January. Wyatt stood up at the end of the ordinary business. "I've got one item," he said. "I'm putting Eliza Marlowe's name forward for association membership." The room reacted about the way anyone would expect. "Wyatt, she doesn't own land," somebody said. "That's the requirement. You've got to hold title." "That's right. So she can't." "She held title in June," Wyatt said. 40 acres on the east side that her father broke with his own hands. She sold it on the 4th of December for $380. He looked around the room. "Every man in here knows where that money went. 6 of you had a share of it come back to you in January when Corley voided those surveys. Henderson, you got your spring back. Ochoa boys got their father's transfer voided. That happened because she sold the only thing she owned." Nobody said anything. "So here's where we are," Wyatt said. "This association has a rule that says you have to hold land to belong. And the only reason she doesn't hold land is that she spent it on us. If we hide behind that rule now, then the rule isn't a rule anymore. It's just a way of saying no to the person who did the work." Henderson stood up. He was not a man who spoke at meetings. He had attended for 22 years and had spoken maybe 9 times. "I'll amend the bylaw," he said. "Membership by contribution to the interests of the valley, voted by 2/3. I'll write it tonight, and I'd like it on the floor in May." "Seconded," said Orrin Teague, who wasn't a member and had no standing to second anything, and nobody told him so. Passed in May 26-8. Eliza was not at that meeting. She was out on the north section with 2 of the Ochoa brothers and a soil auger, because the compaction work had gone better than she'd projected, and she wanted to know why before she recommended it to anybody else. Tobe Whitfield rode out to tell her. She listened to the whole thing. Then she said 26-8. "Yes, ma'am." "Who were the 8? Tobe's face fell a little. "Does it matter?" Eliza thought about the letter in the dirt on the main street of Red Hollow, about Clement Pryor's sideways glance, about Henderson saying, "You've got nothing. That's why you can do this," and being right, and coming back 4 days later and signing anyway. "No," she said, and picked the auger back up. "No, I suppose it doesn't. My name is Eliza Marlowe, And I am 62 years old, and I am going to tell you the rest of it myself. I've let somebody else tell it up to now. That's easier. When you tell a thing from the outside, you can make yourself a little braver than you were, a little cleaner. You can leave out the parts where you were petty. You can leave out the night you sat on a burned foundation with 16 field books in your lap and thought, with your whole chest, I hope he dies badly. I'm not going to leave those parts out anymore. I'm too old, and there's nobody left alive who I'd be protecting. So the spring after the hearing, I want you to understand something about winning 6 out of 19. Everybody in that courthouse hugged each other in the corridor. Ada Greer told the story for a month. And then February came, and the ground froze, and the burned barn was still a burned barn. And Harlan Voss still owned 4,000 acres and 2 commissioners and 61% of the paper in the bank. We had not beaten him. We had made him bleed a little in public. There's a difference, and the difference is the next 4 years. Here's what he did in March. He sued me. Not Wyatt. Not the association. Not Ashcombe, who'd actually argued the case. He filed a civil action against Eliza Marlowe personally in the amount of $11,000 for slander and interference with contract, and he had it served on me at the Calder Ranch on a Tuesday morning by a boy of about 16 who apologized twice while he handed it over. $11,000. I want you to sit with that number for a second, the way I sat with it. I had at that point in my life in cash $42. I owned no land. I owned 2 dresses, a pair of boots that were wrong for the work, and a notebook. He knew all of that. That was the entire point. Do you understand what he was doing? He wasn't trying to collect $11,000 from a woman who didn't have 11 cents. He was showing every other person in that valley what happens to you. He was saying, look at her. She won. And now she'll spend the next 3 years of her life in a lawyer's office instead of on her land, and she'll never be free of me, and neither will you. I sat down on the kitchen step with that paper in my hands and I cried. First time in 9 months. Not from fear I want to be exact, because I've spent my life trying to be exact about things from pure, sick exhaustion. The kind where your body understands, before your mind does, that it is going to be asked to do all of it again. Wyatt found me there. He read it over my shoulders and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, I'll sell the north section. Don't be stupid. Eliza, you'll sell the north section. And then you'll have no water. And then he'll have you inside 18 months. And then he'll come back for me anyway, with a stronger hand. I wiped my face with my sleeve like a child. That's not help. That's just losing in a nicer order. Then tell me what is. And I remember looking up at him and thinking he's asking me. Even now, even with a burned barn and a lawsuit and everything on fire, he's still asking me instead of telling me. That's the thing I'd never had in my whole life until I was 29 years old. Not romance, not rescue. Somebody asking me what I thought and then waiting for the answer. Give me a week, I said. Here's the part I've never told anybody except Wyatt and one other person. I nearly settled. Voss's new attorney Falk was gone by then. He'd withdrawn in February, and I heard later. He never took another matter. Out of Red Hollow County sent word through Merritt Shaw that the suit would be dropped entirely if I signed a paper agreeing to make no further public statement regarding Harlan Voss or his holdings, and to decline any further participation in proceedings relating to the survey matter. That's all. Sign that. And $11,000 goes away. I sat with that offer for 4 days, and I want you to know that I wanted to take it. I'm not going to pretend I was strong. I lay in that bunkhouse and did arithmetic about what my life could look like if I just stopped. I could keep working. I could keep the books. I'd have my wages and my room and a job I was good at, and nobody would ever serve me another paper as long as I lived. I was so tired. You cannot know how tired unless you've done it 9 months of being the person who has to be right, in a room where everyone is waiting for you to be wrong. What stopped me wasn't courage. What stopped me was Ruth Dunmore. She came out on the Thursday with a jar of preserves as an excuse and sat in that kitchen and talked about nothing for 20 minutes and then said, Papa's asking when the rest of it happens. The rest of what? The other 13. She looked at her hands. He's got it in his head that there's 13 more families and somebody's going to say their names too. I've told him it's finished, that the judge already ruled, but he doesn't. She stopped. He asks every day, Eliza, every single day. It's the only thing he holds on to anymore. And I sat there with a settlement offer in my apron pocket that required me, in writing, to never speak about it again. I want to be honest with you about what I felt. It wasn't nobility. It was shame. Hot, ugly shame at the picture of myself signing that paper and then driving out to the Dunmore place and looking that old man in the face. So I didn't sign it. And I'd like to tell you I made a brave choice. But the truth is I made a choice I could live inside, which is a different and much smaller thing. And I think most of what people call courage is actually just that. What I did instead took 4 years. I'm going to tell it fast, because the slow version is 4 years of paper and it would bore you. And because the important part isn't the mechanism. The important part is the thing I learned, and I'll get to that. The lawsuits against me went to hearing in November of that year and was dismissed in 90 minutes. Truth is an absolute defense to slander. And by November, the Territorial Attorney General had already indicted 2 men on the Reyes preamble, and Judge Corley, different judge, but Corley's findings were in the record, had already voided 6 surveys as fraudulent. You cannot slander a man by proving something in his own county's courthouse. His attorney knew that in March. He filed it anyway. That's what I want you to understand about how men like that operate. They file things they know they'll lose because the losing costs them $400, and it costs you your whole year. I lost my whole year. I want that counted. The banking examiner came in the spring term, as Corley ordered. It took him 11 weeks. What he found was that Harlan Voss had been using deposit guarantees at Red Hollow Savings as leverage in private transactions for 9 years, which was not, as it turned out, crime under territorial law at the time, but which was enough that the examiner ordered the bank restructured, ordered Voss's guarantee position dissolved, and ordered Merritt Shaw removed as an officer. Shaw lost the bank. He'd known he would. He answered the subpoena anyway. I went to see him after. He was living in 2 rooms over the harness shop, and he'd started drinking a little. And I'll be plain, I didn't like him, and I never did. He'd set the 14% trap in the first place. He'd sold Wyatt's note. He was a soft, frightened man who did a great deal of harm by being soft and frightened. He also told the truth under oath when he could have lied and kept his bank. Both of those things are true about the same man. I've come to think that's true about most people, and that the great mistake of my early life was believing that folks came in 2 kinds. The Reyes matter went to a criminal court in the territorial capital in the spring of the following year. Voss was not the defendant, his attorney from 1000. 878 was a man named Corwin Balfour, who had drafted that preamble, and Voss's ranch manager from that era, and Elias Pike, who was already serving. Balfour testified against Voss to save himself 4 years. That was the day it broke open. Not the courthouse in Harwick. Not my little 6 of 19 victory. A lawyer in a good coat sitting in a capital courtroom explaining, in exchange for a reduced sentence, exactly how the arrangement had worked for 15 years, with dates, with figures, with the names of the 2 county commissioners. I wasn't there. I couldn't afford the journey. I read about it in a newspaper 4 days late, sitting on the water trough in the Calder yard, and when I got to the part where Balfour named the commissioners, I had to put it down and walk out to the north fence and stand there for a while. Harlan Voss was indicted on 22 counts in the September of the 4th year. He never stood trial. I want to tell you that too, because the stories always end with the villain in chains and mine doesn't. He sold 1,100 acres to pay his defense, and his attorneys fought it for 2 years, and in the end he pled to 4 counts of fraudulent filing and paid a fine of $6,000 and served 19 months. 19 months, for 15 years and 9 families. Ruth Dunmore's father died 4 months before the plea. He never got to hear it. I need you to hear how that felt, because everything else I'm going to say depends on it. I had given 4 years. I had lost my father's land, most of my 20s, the skin on the backs of my hands, and a year of my life to a lawsuit designed to bleed me. And the man who did it went away for 19 months and came back and lived in a decent house in Harwick until he died of a stroke at 68. That is not justice. I have never once pretended it was. And I'm going to tell you something that I think matters more than any of the rest of this. I decided it was enough anyway. Not because it was fair. It wasn't. Because I looked at the arithmetic of my own life and understood that I had exactly one of them and that I could spend the remainder of it dragging Harlan Voss behind me like a stone. Or I could set the stone down and go build something. Everybody talks about forgiveness like it's a gift you give the other person. It isn't. I never forgave that man, and I'm not going to pretend to now at 62, with a clear conscience and a bad hip. What I did was decide he'd had enough of me. 4 years was what he got. He didn't get the rest. That's the first thing I want to leave you with, and I'd like you to actually sit with it, because I think it's the hardest one. You are allowed to stop fighting a person before you have won, without that meaning they beat you. Setting it down is not surrender. Sometimes it's the only way to get your life back out of their hands. Now let me tell you about the rest of it, because the rest of it is the part I'd want on my stone if I got a stone. The Calder Ranch in the year of the hearing ran 210 head, had 4 men, a burned barn, and a banknote we'd only just cleared. 31 years later, it ran 4,200 head across 11,000 acres, with 61 people drawing wages, a water system that served 9 other operations, and a name that got said in the same sentence as outfits 4 times its size in Colorado and Wyoming. I'm not going to walk you through 31 years of cattle, but I'll tell you the 3 decisions that made it, because none of them were the ones people assume. The first was water, and everybody knows about the water, so I'll be brief. We spent 6 years and every spare dollar building a distribution system off the North Creek reservoirs, gravity lines, the works. In the drought years of the following decade, when half the valley went under, we sold water at a rate I set myself, which was low enough that people could pay it, and high enough that nobody had to feel like they were taking charity. That's not generosity, whatever they said about it later. That's the best business decision I ever made. You cannot build an empire in a valley of ruined neighbors. A rich man surrounded by broke men is just a target with a fence. The second was the shares. In the fall of the 3rd year, I sat down with Wyatt and told him I wanted to convert the ranch's wage structure. Every man who'd been with us 3 years would take a share of the annual sale in addition to wages. Not a token, a real percentage written down that a man could count on and plan a life around. He said, "That's going to cost us a fortune. It's going to cost us about 11%. Over 30 years, that's a fortune." "Over 30 years," I said, "we'll never lose a good man to a bigger outfit, and every single person on this place will care whether the gate's latched." I slid the paper over. You want to know what the Ochoa brothers did with their share money in the first year? Tomas bought his mother some stuff. Rafael paid a doctor. They were building things. Men who are building things don't quit. He signed it. By the 10th year, 4 of our foremen had bought land of their own inside the county small places, 300 and 400 acres, and every one of them ran their cattle with ours, and bought their water from our system, and voted with us in the association. I hadn't planned that. I'd like to say I had. I hadn't. It just turned out that when you let people build, they build near you. The third decision was Cal Renner, and it wasn't a decision so much as a thing I did without thinking and then spent 40 years being grateful for. Cal turned 60 the spring after the hearing and started talking about it constantly, in that way old men do, when they've decided they're a burden and are waiting to be contradicted. So in the 4th year, I made him head of operations and gave him 2 things: authority over every man on the place and a chair. The chair was the real gift. It sat in the corner of the main office, and it was a good chair, a proper one, and it meant Cal Renner could come in and sit down at 11 in the morning without having to invent a reason. He held that job for 19 years. He trained every foreman we ever had. He was still coming into that office at 78 and telling me which of the new men had a bad habit and which ones would be worth something in 5 years. And he was right about nearly all of them. He died in his sleep at 81. His wife's sister found him. He'd left instructions that he was not to be buried in Red Hollow, but out on the Calder North section. And there was a fuss about it with the county for 2 weeks. And I stood in an office and argued until they let us. The stone says Calvin Renner. He fetched the arms. Nobody outside about 6 people knows what that means. That's all right. It wasn't for them. I'll tell you about Wyatt now. People always want that part. For 30 years, people came to that ranch and looked at the 2 of us and tried to work out the arrangement, and I got tired of it before I was 40. Here is the truth. We married in the 6th year, not the 1st, not the 2nd, the 6th. And I want to tell you why, because it's the thing I'm proudest of, and it's the thing nobody understood at the time. He asked me in the 2nd year. It was a bad ask. He did it in the yard badly, after a long day, and about half of what he said was some version of it would stop the talk. I said no. He said, "That's not Eliza. That's not the only reason." I know it isn't. It's the reason you led with. I remember I was holding a bucket and I set it down so I could say it properly. Wyatt, if I marry you in the second year, then for the rest of my life, every single thing I do here gets explained by that. Every good year, every decision, every man I hire, it all becomes the rancher's wife. And I have spent 29 years being explained by other people. I'm not going to hand somebody a better explanation. He took that hard. We didn't talk properly for about 3 weeks, and it was miserable, and both of us behaved badly. He was cold and I was righteous, which is worse. He asked again in the 6th year. By then, the water system was 3 years in. I'd been an association member for 4. I'd been named in a territorial agricultural bulletin as a consulting authority on aquifer management, and there were men writing 2 days to ask me questions about their land. He did it in the kitchen, in February, and what he said was, I've thought about this for 4 years, and here's where I've landed. I don't want a partner in the ranch. I've already got one, and she's better at it than me, and everybody knows it. I want a partner in the rest, the part that isn't cattle. There's about 40 years of that left, and I don't want to do it across a table from you. I said yes before he finished. We had 34 years. He died at 71 in the spring of something in his chest that came on fast. I was with him. We didn't have children. I want to say that plainly, because for a long time it was the thing people whispered, and there were years, my 30s, mostly when it sat in me like a stone. We tried. It didn't happen. There's no lesson in it, and I've never found one, and I've stopped looking, and I'd say to any woman carrying that particular grief that you are not required to make it mean something. What we had instead was this: 61 people on that place, and I knew every one of their children's names. And 11 of those children grew up and came back and worked for us, and 4 of them run outfits in that valley now. I'm not going to dress that up as a substitute. It isn't. Just what there was, and it turned out to be a great deal. Now the part about the town. Because this is where I want to be careful, and where most stories lie. The story people tell about Red Hollow is that the town that laughed at me came around and admired me. That's the shape everyone likes. The forgotten girl becomes the queen, and the ones who mocked her line up to bow. It didn't happen that way, and I want to say what actually did, because I think the truth is better. Some of them came around fast and honestly. Clement Pryor did. Ada Greer did. Henderson did, and he did it at cost, and he did it out loud at an association meeting when it would have been easier to do it quietly. Some of them came around slowly and dishonestly, which is the most common way. By the 15th year, there were men in Red Hollow telling people they'd supported me from the beginning, who had voted against Wyatt in that back room at the Palace Hotel. I knew exactly who they were. I never once said anything about it. You want to know why? Because they were useful. They were on my side now, and being on my side now was what I actually needed. And correcting the record about 1,885 would have cost me a vote in 1,901. That's not noble. That's how anything actually gets built. I'd rather tell you that than tell you a pretty version. And some of them never came around at all. There was a woman in that town, I won't say her name. Half her grandchildren still lived there, who told people for 40 years that I'd gotten everything I had by getting into Wyatt Calder's bed. 40 years. She said it at my wedding. She said it when the water system went in. She said it, I'm told, at Wyatt's funeral, in the churchyard, to a cousin of his. I never confronted her. I thought about it 100 times. I had a speech worked out by about 1,890, and I never used it. Here's what I've come to about that, and it's the second thing I want to leave you with. Some people are never going to see you, and the amount of your life you spend trying to make them is a straight subtraction from the amount you spend being seen by the people who already do. I could have spent 30 years working on that woman. I could have proved it to her 100 different ways. She'd have found 101 explanations. Because she wasn't confused, she wasn't missing information she had decided, and a person who has decided is not a person you can argue with. Meanwhile, there was a hydrologist in the territorial capital who wrote me letters for 20 years about groundwater. There was Cal in his chair. There was Ruth Dunmore, who I saw every month until she died. There was a girl named Constanza Ochoa, Tomas's daughter, who I taught to read a deed when she was 11, and who ran 4,000 acres of her own by the time she was 40. That's where the life was. Not in the argument. Never in the argument. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened, because it's the only time I ever saw Harlan Voss again, and I've never known quite what to do with it. It was the 22nd year. He was 66 by then, out of prison for a long time, living in Harwick on what was left. I was in Harwick for a stock commission meeting. I came out of a building on the main street, and he was standing across the road. He'd gotten old, the way hard men get old, not softened, just reduced, like something left in the sun. Good coat still, bad shoulders. He saw me, I saw him see me, and I want to tell you what I felt, and I'd ask you to believe me, even though it's not the dramatic answer. I felt nothing. I stood there on that boardwalk, waiting for the thing I'd carried for 22 years to arrive, the rage, the vindication, the great swelling moment where I got to look at him and know, and it didn't come. What came instead was a kind of mild surprise, the way you feel when you run into a school teacher you'd forgotten was still alive. He crossed the street. I let him. I didn't move. He stopped about 6 feet off, and he said, "Miss Marlowe." "Mrs. Calder," I said, not to correct him, just because it was accurate. He nodded slowly, and then he said the strangest thing anybody has ever said to me. He said, "I've thought about that letter." I waited. "The one on the street," he said, "in front of the land office. I know which one." He looked off down the road for a while. Then he said, "If I'd handed it to you decent, would any of the rest of it have happened?" And here's what I've never gotten over. He wasn't apologizing. There was nothing in his face that was sorry. He was asking a business question. 22 years later, having lost a ranch and a name and 19 months of his life, and the thing he wanted to know was whether he'd made a tactical error. He genuinely did not understand that there was anything else to ask. I said, "Probably not. That's what I've thought." "That's not the interesting part, though." He looked at me. "The interesting part," I said, "is that you'd been throwing letters at people for 15 years, and it worked every single time. 9 families. It worked on all of them. It wasn't a mistake, Mr. Voss. It was your whole method, and it was a good method. I put my gloves on. You just happened to use it one time on somebody with nothing left to lose and a habit of writing things down. That's not a lesson. That's weather." He stood there. I walked to my horse and rode home, and I have never in 22 years since told anybody about that conversation. Not even Wyatt. I don't fully know why. I think it's because I didn't want anyone to know that when I finally got the moment, the one I'd rehearsed in a bunkhouse house at 3 a.m. for a decade, it turned out I didn't want it. I'd outgrown it. And there's a grief in that too. The way there's grief in outgrowing anything. He died 2 years later. I didn't go. 6 people from Red Hollow went to that funeral, and I'm told 4 of them were there to make sure. I'm going to tell you the last thing now, and then I'm going to stop. 3 weeks ago, a girl came out to this ranch, 17 years old, from a small place east of here that I'd never heard of. She'd taken a train and then a wagon, and then walked the last 4 miles, which I did not learn until later, and which nearly finished me when I did. She stood in my kitchen with her hands twisted up in front of her and said she'd read about me in an agricultural bulletin, a school library, and she wanted to know how a person learns land. I said, "Who sent you?" "Nobody, ma'am." "Does your family know you're here?" "My father knows." A pause. "He says it's foolishness." And I looked at that girl, skinny, dusty, wrong boots, terrified, 17, and I want to tell you what went through me. It wasn't tenderness. Not at first. What I felt first was something close to fury, and it took me a full minute to understand what it was fury at. It was at the arithmetic. I was 29 before anybody asked me a question and waited for the answer. 29. I had the notebook from the time I was 17, and it sat in a drawer for 12 years while I sold flour, because there was no door and nobody in that town could imagine building one. 12 years. That's what it cost me. That's what it cost my father's land. And the Dunmore well, and 9 families, because if somebody had listened to me at 17 instead of 29, I'd have found Elias Pike in 1,873. That's the arithmetic that made me angry. Not what was done to me. What was wasted. So I said to her, "Sit down. What do you want to know?" She was there 4 hours. I gave her a bed. She's still here. She's out on the south section this morning, with a soil auger, which I can see from the window where I'm sitting. And she has been wrong about 3 things this week, and right about 1. And the one she was right about was a thing I hadn't seen. Her name's Marta. I've told Constanza Ochoa to keep an eye on her when I'm gone, and Constanza said she already had. So here's what I've got. 62 years old, and this is all of it. Nobody is coming to discover you. I waited 12 years for that, and it never happened. And the only reason my life turned is that a tired man walked into a dry goods store and asked one question. One. That's the entire hinge. If Wyatt Calder had been slightly less desperate or slightly more proud, I'd have died behind that counter, and every word in this account would be nothing but a notebook in a drawer that somebody's grandchildren threw out. That terrifies me. It has terrified me for 30 years. And it's why I say the next part with everything I've got. Be the person who asks the question. You will meet in your life dozens of people that everybody has agreed are not worth listening to. Quiet one, the poor one, the one who talks funny, the old woman, the girl in the wrong boots. Everyone around you will have already decided about them, and the decision will be so complete that it won't even feel like a decision, it'll feel like a fact about the world. Ask them anyway. Ask them and then shut your mouth and wait, which is the hard part, because most people who ask are just waiting for their turn. You will be wrong most of the time. Most people, when asked, do not have 31 field books worth of anything in them. That's fine. The cost of asking is 4 minutes. The cost of not asking is a woman selling flour for 12 years with a valley's worth of stolen water sitting in her notebook. And if you are the one nobody asks, and I suspect some of you are, or you'd have stopped listening to an old woman by now, I don't have a comfortable thing to tell you. I'm not going to say be patient. I was patient for 12 years, and patience did nothing for me at all. Patience is what they recommend to you precisely because it costs them nothing. What I'll say instead is, keep the notebook, whatever your notebook is. The thing you know that nobody has asked about. The skill, the eye, the 12 years of noticing. Keep it current. Keep it honest. Write it down, because writing it down is how a thing survives the years when nobody wants it. And because I promise you this, it's the only thing in this whole account I'd swear to the day may come. Without warning, on an ordinary Tuesday, in a place you go every day, when somebody who has run out of options finally turns around and asks. And on that day, the entire difference between the life you had and the life you get is whether you have anything ready to say. I had something ready. That's the whole story. That's all it was. A woman who kept writing things down in a town that had decided she was nobody, and one man who got desperate enough to ask, and 9 families who found out they had never been alone, only kept apart. The rest is just cattle.